Good evening, dear dreamer. Chris here tonight. We're going to continue our journey throughout the worst kings in history. Let's get started. A gentle warning: when power fails the people once, the idea of a king shimmered like a distant star anointed by divine right, believed to be chosen not just by people, but by the heavens. Monarchs were seen as shepherds of their lands, tasked with guarding the peace, guiding their subjects, and holding a sacred connection to the divine. Crowns were not just ornaments. They were symbols of harmony, of order imposed gently upon the unpredictable tide of human life. For centuries, this belief gave people comfort, especially in uncertain times. When plagues struck, or war loomed, or the harvest failed, there was solace in thinking that a higher hand had appointed someone to protect them. This king was supposed to be wise, just, and merciful, a beacon in the fog of human uncertainty. It was a story people told themselves for generations. But stories, like power, can fray with time. The belief in monarchy was rooted in stability. Castles stood tall not only to withstand siege, but to represent a steadfastness against chaos. From the golden thrones of Egypt to the icy fortresses of the north, kings ruled under the watchful eyes of ancestors and gods. Yet, beneath the surface of ritual and splendor, lay the quiet truth that power was often less divine than desired. Many kings rose not for virtue but for lineage. Blood, not wisdom, often paved the path to the throne when one person holds all. The keys when no voice can question, no hand can stay the sword. Something begins to decay, quietly at first. The danger of absolute rule is not only in what a king may do, but in what others are afraid to say. Over time, a court becomes a mirror, not of truth, but of fear. Servants nod too quickly. Advisors grow silent. And the king, once a leader, becomes isolated on a throne of whispers. Unchecked power rarely brings peace. It often breeds suspicion. The ruler begins to question loyalty in every corner. Friends become threats. Family becomes rivals. The crown becomes heavier, and the king lonelier. The promise of noble rule withers under the weight of decisions made in echo chambers. Justice grows dimmer. Mercy thins. Worse still, for those under such a king, life becomes a performance. To survive, one must flatter. To speak truth becomes an act of rebellion. And as years pass, people forget what real leadership feels like. They learn only fear. The world bends around a single voice. Until it snaps, there were kings who genuinely tried. But even the kindest ruler, when left unchallenged, begins to drift from reality. Power, when left alone, does not rest, it festers. It erodes empathy. It blinds. Not in fire, but in quiet. The most dangerous kings are not always the cruelest, they are often the loneliest. And so, we come to those whose reigns left behind long shadows, rulers who were meant to protect, but became the very storm they were crowned to prevent. Gaius Caligula, once a promise of restoration, turned into a spectacle of cruelty. Pope John XII, given the keys to Christendom, traded piety for indulgence. Ivan the Terrible, driven by paranoia, carved fear into his people's bones. Their stories are not shouted. They are whispered through the halls of ruined palaces and etched into the dusty margins of forgotten books. These were not evil men in black and white. They were human. And in that humanity, we see reflection. Each misstep, each unchecked whim, each silenced critic contributed to a slow unraveling. Their legacies are not just tales of war or madness. They are stories of moments, missed opportunities to choose compassion, ignored. Even monarchs like Mary, Queen of Scots, or Richard II, whose reigns teetered between youth and ambition, remind us how fragile power truly is. It's not only the sword that defines a reign, But the silence that follows it, this series does not seek to condemn, but to understand. To walk slowly through the lives of rulers who failed not to mock, but to learn. For in every throne room, there is a moment when the crown could have been lighter, had the heart beneath it been stronger. In today's world, the echoes of old kingdoms may feel distant. Yet the nature of power has not changed. It still tempts, still isolates, still corrupts when unchecked. These kings lived in times very different from ours, yet the lessons they leave behind feel hauntingly current. They remind us how easy it is to lose our way when we forget to listen, when we forget humility. Looking back helps us see forward. These stories of flawed rulers help us question our leaders, our institutions, and even ourselves. They are quiet warnings wrapped in golden robes and shattered crowns. They tell us, beware the leader who listens only to praise. Beware the ruler who silences truth. Beware the throne built too high. As we begin this journey through the lives of the worst kings in history, let us move gently but clearly, not with anger, but with reflection, not with judgment, but with care. For these were not just rulers, they were people with choices. And in understanding their fall, we may better protect what still stands. Let us now begin. Gaius Caligula, madness on the marble throne. The Roman Empire was a place of marble temples, golden laurel wreaths, and soldiers that marched beneath crimson banners. In this world, young Gaius, known affectionately as Caligula, was born into both privilege and pain. His father, Germanicus, was a beloved general, honored by the people and adored by his troops. The boy often accompanied him, wearing tiny soldier boots called caligae, which earned him the nickname that would follow him forever. Little Boots was a symbol of hope in an empire weary of fear and control under Tiberius, the withdrawn and suspicious emperor who ruled before him. Caligula's early life was surrounded by whispers and shadows. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was proud and outspoken, and that boldness did not sit well with the suspicious Tiberius. Over time, the family found themselves falling from favor. Germanicus died under mysterious circumstances, and one by one, members of Caligula's family perished or disappeared. Young Gaius was sent to live on the island of Capri, under the watch of the aging emperor. It was here, away from the bright bustle of Rome, that the seeds of change may have first been planted. When Tiberius finally died, Caligula was welcomed as a savior. Rome rejoiced in the streets. Citizens lit torches and filled the avenues with cheer. Statues were raised in his honor. After years of somber leadership, they now had a youthful, charming figure who seemed to understand them. In those early days, he was generous, granting bonuses to soldiers, forgiving certain debts, and restoring democratic practices the Senate had long yearned for. The empire breathed a little easier, wrapped in the promise of kindness and stability, but promises can be fragile. And within the marble halls of the palace, something unseen was beginning to shift. Not long into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. The exact nature of the sickness is still debated by historians. Some believe it was epilepsy, others suspect a mental breakdown. Whatever the cause, the man who emerged from that illness was not the same as the one the people had once celebrated. Gone was the cheerful ruler who had greeted crowds with open arms. In his place stood someone harder, colder, and more erratic. Whispers in the court spoke of wild mood swings, sudden rages, and long periods of isolation. His laughter rang louder, but without warmth. He began to see threats everywhere within. His own advisers, the Senate, and even his family. This transformation disturbed many. Senators grew nervous in his presence, unsure of what might spark his fury. Those who had once dined with him now feared receiving an invitation. But Caligula's illness did more than darken his mood. It seemed to loosen his grip on reality. Stories emerged of him talking to the moon, of building temples for himself, of speaking as if he were a god. The people of Rome, once delighted by their new emperor, began to worry. Bread and circuses no longer distracted from the unsettling. Decrees and strange public appearances. Even those close to him could no longer predict his next move. A shadow had fallen over the empire, and the man who had once brought light now wandered deeper into something far more troubling with each passing month. Caligula's rule became more surreal. He demanded divine honors, ordering temples be built not for Jupiter or Mars, but for himself. He declared himself a living god, and insisted that statues of the old deities be altered to bear his likeness. The line between ruler and deity began to blur, but not in reverence. It was confusion. It was fear. He ordered his horse Incitatus be made a consul, the highest office in the Roman Senate. Whether this was a joke or an insult remains unclear. But it signaled something deeper, a disregard for governance, a mockery of those around him, and a need to prove his absolute power in the most unusual ways. Decisions no longer followed law or logic. Instead, they bent to his passing moods. His whims, his need for control. Public executions became more frequent. Sometimes they were held during feasts. Other times they followed a failed jest. Nobles were stripped of their wealth on a whim. Friends disappeared overnight. The marble walls of the palace held secrets, and behind them, fear spread like wildfire. The people, once joyous, now walked carefully. Senators chose their words as if every syllable might be their last. The streets of Rome echoed with uncertainty. And above it all, Caligula watched, distant and unreachable, surrounded by gold, guarded by silence, and crowned by delusion. Absolute power often sows its own end. By the 4th year of his reign, Caligula had made enemies of nearly everyone around him. The Senate resented his humiliation. The Praetorian Guard, his own protectors, feared his volatility. Even his once loyal inner circle could no longer trust his judgment. The final blow came quietly. In 41 AD, a conspiracy was born not from ambition, but desperation. Led by Cassius Caria, a member of the Praetorian Guard whom Caligula had repeatedly mocked, the plan unfolded with precision. In a secluded hallway within the imperial palace, Caligula was surrounded and struck down. His cries echoed off the stone, but no help came. The empire stood still. There was no public mourning, no great funeral procession. The man who once inspired festivals now vanished without celebration. His statues were torn down. His name whispered less and less. The Senate even tried to erase his memory, hoping to scrub clean the scars of his reign, but history remembers. Not for the sake of cruelty, but for the lessons buried in the chaos. Caligula's fall was not sudden. It was slow and filled with signs. A boy raised in shadows. A sickness left untreated. Power without pause or question, and as Rome moved on. The marble throne stood tall, once more waiting for the next to sit, to rule, and perhaps to fall. Pope John XII, the Holy Crown, profaned in the quiet heart of Rome, beneath domes and incense, the keys of St. Peter passed into the hands of a boy. Pope John XII, born Octavianus, was just 17 years old when he became the head of the Catholic Church. It was a moment wrapped in ritual and reverence, but behind the velvet and gold, uncertainty lingered. The ancient weight of papal authority, passed down through centuries, had never rested on shoulders so unformed. Rome was not merely a city of ruins and saints. It was a crossroads of empires, and the Pope its guardian, the world into which John. Step was one of politics and power, disguised as holiness. The papacy, once an emblem of spiritual guidance, had become entangled in the rough fingers of noble families, each vying to place their own on the throne of Peter. Octavianus was chosen, not for his virtue or vision, but because he belonged to the powerful Tusculan dynasty. His name carried influence, and influence, in Rome, meant control. For a teenager, the throne of St. Peter was less a divine calling than a gilded trap. The palaces, the attendants, the wealth all came too quickly, too easily. The boy pope, who might have studied scripture, now held audiences with kings. The one who should have knelt in silence found himself seated in judgment. The weight of robes can crush a spirit, not yet shaped by time. It is difficult to know exactly what John felt in those early days. There are no letters filled with doubt, no reflections preserved in diaries. Only actions, whispered accounts, and troubled chronicles. And from them, a picture begins to emerge, a youth seduced not just by power, but by its many distractions. While Rome watched, the boy who wore the fisherman's ring began to slip away from its meaning. The sacred became secondary. The holy. Garments once symbols of sacrifice became mere ornaments. And the church, meant to guide, began to drift. The Vatican halls, once echoing with solemn chants, soon filled with music of a different kind. Pope John Chi's papacy, rather than being marked by acts of reform or reverence, unraveled into scandalous tales of indulgence and distraction. The young pope held feasts more extravagant than royal banquets, inviting nobles and lovers alike. Wine flowed through marble chambers, while prayers quietly dried in forgotten pages. He was said to have turned the Lateran palace into a place not of pilgrimage, but of play. Women walked its halls not in habit or veil, but in silk and jewels. High clergy whispered of orgies held under painted ceilings where saints once stared down. Confession was no longer a practice of soul cleansing. For John, it seemed, sin was something to sample, not avoid. These accounts, passed on by monks and messengers, paint a papacy that mistook its role. Rather than being shepherd to the flock, John became a prince among pleasures. Rather than speak for the poor, he dined with the powerful. Even sacred offices were bartered. Bishoprics and blessings were sold to the highest bidder. The church, guardian of heaven's gate, became a marketplace. And John, young and untethered, stood at its center. It is easy to reduce these stories to scandal, to laugh or shake one's head. But beneath them lies a deeper tragedy. The tragedy of a soul given too much too soon. A child dressed in holy robes who never truly understood their weight. A throne meant to guide millions becoming a mirror of one man's lost path. Rome murmured, and Europe listened. Even the faithful began to wonder, if the Pope could fall so far, what of the Church itself? Doubt, like a quiet tide, began to rise. The spiritual ground beneath Rome began to tremble, not with the fury of mobs or fires, but with the subtler shift of faith into disillusionment. Within monasteries and abbeys, monks spoke of a shepherd who had abandoned his sheep. Priests wept behind closed doors, unsure how to defend a church that had forgotten its own teachings. Pope John Chi's reign became a storm the church could not contain. The council of bishops grew restless. Political allies turned distant. Even Emperor Otto I, once aligned with the papacy, began to question the young pope's place. In 963, the Holy Roman Emperor himself marched on Rome, not with the intent to conquer, but to correct. He convened a synod, a formal church council, to examine the charges against John. And there were many: simony, perjury, murder, and blasphemy. More than a list of sins, a lament of a reign gone astray. John fled Rome, rather than face the council, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty. In his absence, the bishops declared him deposed. A new pope was appointed. But the story, like history often does, took another turn. John returned, backed by loyal forces. The city, caught between devotion and rebellion, watched as chaos deepened. Priests loyal to the council clashed with those who still saw John as pope. Blood spilled where incense once rose. What began as spiritual confusion had become a political civil war. And in the center stood a boy who had never truly grown into his crown. A man who wore the ring of St. Peter, but wielded it like a sword. Faith wavered. Trust cracked. And yet the church endured. Its stones held, even as the voices within them faltered. The sins of one pope did not destroy it, but they left scars that would take generations to heal. In 964, just as the echoes of his final conflict began to fade, Pope John XII died unexpectedly. He was no older than 24. His death was not marked by martyrdom, nor honored with solemn tribute. Some said he died in bed, struck down by a jealous husband. Others whispered of divine punishment, a soul reaped by judgment. And no clear answer ever came. Only the silence that follows disgrace. He was buried without fanfare. The church moved on. In death, as in life, John left behind contradiction. To some, he was a symbol of all that could go wrong when power is handed to the unready. To others, he was a reminder of how fragile institutions are. When built upon names instead of values, his legacy was not written in doctrine, but in damage. The papacy, shaken by his reign, grew more cautious. Future popes would be chosen with greater scrutiny. Structures were reformed. Checks were introduced. The Holy Crown, once stained, would be polished with stricter hands. Yet, memory is stubborn. John's story remains, not just in dusty texts, but in quiet reflection. A parable whispered through time that even the sacred can be spoiled. That age does not grant wisdom. That robes do not guarantee righteousness. For those who hear his story today, perhaps the lesson is not just about failure, but about humility. That thrones, whether made of wood or marble, ask more than ambition. They ask understanding. They ask patience. And when those are absent, the cost can be profound. So we close the chapter on John 12, not with rage, but with a quiet breath. The Holy Crown profaned, the church wounded, but the world wiser. King John, the broken crown of England, John came to the throne not as the favored heir, but as the last surviving son of Henry II. The death of his brother, King Richard the Lionheart, opened a path John was barely prepared to walk. England, at the time, was a fractured land, struggling with costly foreign wars and restive barons who were growing tired of royal demands. The foundation was already shaky, but John brought more weight than wisdom. Unlike Richard, who inspired loyalty, even through war, John lacked charisma and trustworthiness. His reign began with suspicion and grew heavier with each misstep. John's early decisions created echoes that weakened the throne. He seized the inheritance of noble families, demanded loyalty without fairness, and saw allies turn skeptical. Where a steady hand might have calmed tensions, John's paranoia only stoked flames. As the crown settled on his head, the kingdom beneath it began to splinter. From Ireland to the north of England, grumblings of discontent were not just about taxes, but about the man himself. In John, people saw not just a king, but a ruler losing touch. John's reign became a theater of conflict, marked by battles both abroad and at home. In France, he lost vast stretches of land that had been held by the English crown since the days of his father. Normandy, once a proud jewel in England's dominion, slipped through his fingers. His military campaigns were costly and unsuccessful, draining the royal coffers and morale of his people. Every defeat abroad made him more desperate to assert control at home, but England was no refuge. The barons, burdened by ever-increasing taxes and arbitrary punishments, began to resist. John levied scutage attacks on knights who refused to fight with such frequency and cruelty that even loyal nobles turned wary. The church, too, became an enemy when John defied the Pope over the appointment of an archbishop. England was placed under interdict. Churches closed their doors. Bells stopped ringing. For years, spiritual silence fell over the land as a sign of Rome's disapproval. John's enemies multiplied, not because he faced greater threats, but because he created them out of resistance. Came revolution, and from rebellion came something greater than John could have imagined. The barons, fed up and bold, confronted him with demands. At Runnymede in 1215, beside the river's quiet flow, a reluctant John sealed the Magna Carta. It was not a declaration of freedom, but a boundary. For the first time, a king of England was forced to acknowledge that his power had limits. He could not tax without cause, imprison without trial, or ignore the counsel of his lords. John did not sign Magna Carta out of goodwill. He did it out of fear. Yet in doing so, he planted a seed that would grow long after his reign. Though he would later try to nullify the charter, and though civil war would follow, the words on parchment endured. They echoed through centuries, carried into law by kings, reformers, and revolutionaries. Magna Carta was born from failure, yet it became a symbol of accountability, rights, and resistance. King John died in 1216, his kingdom fractured, his reign defined by loss. He was not mourned by the people, and the crown passed on with more relief than sorrow. He left behind a treasury drained, lands lost, and a nobility that had nearly turned against the very idea of monarchy. Yet in his darkest hour, he left a document that would outlast his memory. History often paints John in harsh tones as greedy, cruel, and cowardly. And yet, in his failures, he unintentionally sparked one of history's most enduring ideas, that no ruler is above the law. Magna Carta did not rescue his name, but it transformed his shadow into a milestone. John's broken reign became a foundation for reform. His defeat, paradoxically, gave birth to a new kind of rule. And so, while his name is remembered with bitterness, it is also linked to the beginnings of modern liberty. A failed king, yes, but one whose failure carried a quiet gift to the world. In the cold corridors of Moscow's Kremlin, behind gilded icons and heavy doors, a boy was born into a cradle of gold and silence. Ivan IV, later known as Ivan the Terrible, entered the world in 1530 not as a ruler yet, but as a witness to the fractures of a crumbling court. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died when Ivan was just 3 years old. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, acted as regent, holding power in his name. But within 5 years, she too was gone, likely poisoned. What followed was not guidance, but neglect. The boy with a crown was now a pawn, the court controlled by noble families, descended into a game of survival. Boyars, the Russian aristocracy, vied for influence, wealth, and proximity to power. And in their games, the child czar was often forgotten, or worse, exploited. Alone in the palace, Ivan grew up surrounded not by tutors or love, but by whispers, hunger, and cruelty. Accounts from the time tell of a boy left to wander the halls, in worn clothes, watching as dogs ate better than he did. At times, he was mocked. At times, he was feared. But always he watched. He remembered, and from that watching, a deep mistrust took root. Ivan grew into adolescence with intelligence and a sharp sense of the world's fragility. He studied history, theology, and statecraft. He read scripture and tales of ancient Rome. But beneath the learning burned something harder, a scar formed too early to ever fully heal. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan crowned himself not merely as Grand Prince, but as Tsar of all Rus, a title no one before him had used. The word Tsar echoed Caesar, drawing from the legacy of Rome and Byzantium. It was not just a title. It was a statement. He was no longer the boy behind the throne. He was the throne itself. But even as the crown settled on his head, the past still echoed. The boy raised in shadows would never fully leave them behind, and that haunting of betrayal, of abandonment, of pain would shape everything to come. In the early years of his reign, Ivan IV showed promise. The troubled child became a bold reformer. For a time, it seemed Russia might enter a new age, one guided by law, faith, and central strength. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a noblewoman of steady grace, whose presence offered him rare calm. Their bond, deep and genuine, tempered him. In her, Ivan found not only a partner, but a brief peace. And in those years, something remarkable happened. Ivan called councils. He invited feedback cautiously, but sincerely. He reformed the legal code, issuing the Sedebnik of 1550, which helped streamline justice and reduce the worst abuses of local lords. He expanded the use of printed documents, formalizing governance. He created the first standing army, the Streltsy, and began restructuring taxation to better support the state. The church was not ignored. Ivan worked to solidify its place beside the crown, using it both as a moral compass and as a pillar of legitimacy. Together, church and state pushed forward, not always kindly, but with intent. In 1552, Ivan led a successful campaign to capture Kazan, the capital of a powerful Tatar Khanate. It was a monumental victory, one that extended Russian influence deep into the Volga region. The conquest was both military and symbolic. Orthodox crosses now stood where minarets once rose. Moscow was becoming more than a city. It was becoming an empire. Foreign observers began to take note. Here was a ruler unlike the distracted boyars of old. Ivan was commanding, educated, and serious about shaping a unified, centralized Russia. But centralization has its cost. The more Ivan built, the more power he gathered. The old noble families grew uneasy. Resistance simmered beneath courtly gestures. And within Ivan, the quiet voice of suspicion once planted in boyhood began to stir again. In 1560, Anastasia died. Poison was suspected. Ivan was devastated. And something inside him broke, not loudly, but deeply. He had built a new Russia with care, ambition, and authority. But now, grief began to reshape the hand that had once healed. Following Anastasia's death, Ivan withdrew into darkness. Grief turned to paranoia. He believed, perhaps rightly, perhaps not, that she had been murdered by his enemies at court. And if they could take her, they could take anything. In 1565, Ivan created the Oprichnina, a separate territory within Russia, governed entirely by him and enforced by his private army, the Oprichniki. Dressed in black, riding black horses, these men carried symbols of death, a dog's head to sniff out treason, and a broom to sweep it away. They were not a guard. They were a force of terror. The Oprichnina became both a region and a policy. Ivan used it to exile, execute, and humiliate nobles he saw as disloyal. Estates were seized, families destroyed. Torture became routine. Public executions were spectacles, designed not just to punish, But to remind everyone who held power, the most infamous act came in 1570. Ivan, suspecting treason in the city of Novgorod, led a brutal campaign of punishment. Thousands were killed. Clergy, merchants, common folk. The river was choked with bodies. Bells rang not for worship, but for mourning, and yet Ivan claimed it was justice, that he was protecting Russia from internal rot, but it was not justice. It was fear given armor and command. During this time, Russia suffered. The economy faltered. Trade routes strained. The Livonian War, a long and bloody attempt to gain access to the Baltic Sea, drained resources with little reward. Famine struck. Villages emptied. Ivan's reign, once full of reform, had become consumed by control. His personality fractured further. One day generous, the next cruel. He lashed out even at those closest to him. In 1581, during a heated argument with his son and heir, Ivan struck the young man with his staff. The blow proved fatal. The death of Ivan Ivanovich, intelligent, capable, and beloved, left Russia without a strong successor. Ivan wept at his son's side. But remorse did not undo the damage. The storm had taken everything, what had begun as a vision of unity had become a reign of isolation. In the final years of his life, Ivan IV became a man surrounded by ghosts. The palace, once alive with councils and reforms, echoed with memories of lost love, of sons, of promises shattered. He remained czar, but the world around him faded. His moods were unpredictable. He searched the stars for signs. He turned to mystics, rituals, and dark omens. He repented in public, but still punished in private. Russia, now vast, was more centralized than ever but brittle. The nobility was broken, but fearful. The common people were burdened. His court was careful, hushed. No one could speak freely. Even the church had learned to lower its eyes. Ivan grew physically frail, but his mind never fully softened. He would alternate between prayer and rage, between regret and silence. In March 1584, Ivan collapsed while playing a game of chess. He died shortly after. His body was buried in the Cathedral of the Archangel in Moscow, beside past rulers of his dynasty. But the empire he left behind stood on uneasy ground. His remaining son, Fyodor, was weak in health and will. A time of chaos, the time of troubles, would soon follow. Ivan IV had begun with vision, with love, with hope. He ended alone, surrounded not by friends or family, but by the remnants of a reign shaped by suspicion and sorrow. And yet, history remembers him not simply as a monster, but as a contradiction. He built the foundation of the Russian state. He challenged the old order. He brought law to chaos. And then he unraveled it. He was reformer and destroyer, builder and breaker, loved by some, feared by most, and mourned by almost none. But even Ivan, the terrible, was not born terrible. He was shaped by a world of betrayal, and in turn shaped. His life reminds us that power, when mixed with pain, can become something no crown should ever bear, and so his legacy lingers not in triumph, but in caution, a shadow across the snow, a silence in the halls of empire, a throne crowned by fire and fear. Richard II, the fragile boy king. Richard II became king at the tender age of 10, thrust into a crown far too heavy for his small shoulders. The year was 1377, and England was a land scarred by war, debt, and unrest. His grandfather, Edward III, had been a warrior king, and his father, the Black Prince, a legend in battle, but both were gone. Left behind was a child with soft eyes and a poetic heart. Those around him, powerful men with competing ambitions, formed councils and factions to rule in his name. In such a world, the boy king became both a figurehead and a pawn. The pressures of the court, the whispered conspiracies, and the expectations of a grieving, weary kingdom all swirled around him. He was not raised in the furnace of war like his ancestors, but rather in the softer glow of literature, religion, and beauty. And while this made him thoughtful and introspective, it also left him vulnerable. In a kingdom hungry for strong leadership, Richard's sensitivity and emotional nature were seen as flaws. Even in his youth, his actions showed glimpses of idealism and pride traits that would one day isolate him. The Peasants' Revolt in 1381 was his first real test. At just 14, Richard surprised many by bravely facing the rebels at Smithfield. He promised reform, calming the storm with words instead of swords. For a brief moment, it seemed that this gentle king might rise to greatness. But the moment faded. The promises were not kept, the leaders of the revolt were executed, and Richard returned to his gilded circle. More insulated than ever, the kingdom moved on. But beneath the ceremony and celebration, the cracks began to spread. Richard remained distant, a boy who never learned how to be a ruler in a world that demanded more. Richard, too, found solace not in politics, but in pageantry. He adored beauty, order, and symbolism. His court was a place of robes, banners, poetry, and ritual. He believed in the divine right of kings not just as a doctrine, but as something sacred. His love for ceremony wasn't just vanity. To Richard, it was a shield against chaos, a way to bring elegance and permanence to a world that often felt threatening. He surrounded himself with artists, architects, and poets. Under his reign, Westminster Hall was transformed with a magnificent hammer-beam roof, a testament to his vision and grandeur. He adopted the emblem of the White Hart, gentle yet elusive, to represent himself. To his supporters, this love of art made him refined and thoughtful. But to many nobles, it seemed detached, frivolous, even dangerous. Richard's emphasis on royal dignity alienated the powerful. He demanded loyalty, not through strength, but through reverence. He expected obedience not because he had earned it on the battlefield, but because he wore the crown. His court became increasingly insular. Those outside its circle felt excluded, even scorned. His favorites gained titles and lands, while old houses felt overlooked. In trying to elevate the monarchy, Richard pushed many away. The symbolism that made him feel secure made others feel small. His rule became more about image than action. And the growing distance between king and kingdom became harder to ignore. As Richard withdrew into beauty and symbolism, discontent grew like ivy in the shadows. The nobility, especially the Lords Appellant, watched with suspicion. They resented his reliance on a small circle of favorites, fearing the king's court was becoming a kingdom unto itself. The crown had become exclusive, secretive, and dismissive of tradition. In 1387, tensions came to a head. The Lords Appellant, including powerful figures like the Duke of Gloucester and the Earl of Arundel, accused the king's allies of treason. The resulting conflict, known as the Merciless Parliament, saw many of Richard's close advisers executed or exiled. Though Richard remained on the throne, the message was clear. His authority was not absolute. Years passed, and Richard bided his time. In the 1390s, with some of his old enemies gone and others more cautious, he began to reassert control. He punished past critics and surrounded himself once again with loyalists. But this second wave of personal rule was colder, more calculated. Forgiveness was rare. Control was tight. He exiled his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, and seized his lands after the death of Henry's father. It was a bold move, but also a mistake. It turned a potential rival into a real one. Across England, whispers of tyranny stirred again. The nobility, once wary, now began to plot. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile not in defiance, but under the pretext of claiming his inheritance. Yet support flooded in. Nobles, clergy, even commoners saw in Henry a chance to restore balance. Richard, perhaps believing his divine right would protect him, delayed action. By the time he moved, it was too late. He was captured without a real battle and forced to abdicate. His crown, once a symbol of unshakable grace, passed to his cousin. Richard's fall was quiet, swift, and strange. The ceremonies he loved did not save him. The throne he believed sacred slipped through his fingers. Imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, Richard faded from public view. No grand statements, no final stand. Just silence. Some said he starved. Others said he was murdered. But in truth, the end came not with fire, but with a whisper. A boy once crowned king now sat alone, forgotten by the world he once ruled, and yet history did not forget. Shakespeare would one day give Richard a voice melancholic, reflective, poetic. A reminder that even in failure, there is something deeply human. Richard, too, was not evil nor heroic. He was, in many ways, a mirror of a time, a crown, and the delicate weight of expectations too great to bear. Mary, Queen of Scots, a throne in turmoil in the quiet halls of the French court, a child born of Scottish royalty, walked in silken slippers, far from the misty highlands of her homeland. Mary Stuart was only 6 days old when she became Queen of Scotland, an infant monarch wrapped not in ceremony, but in vulnerability. To ensure her safety and secure alliances, she was sent to France at the tender age of 5. There, she was raised among elegance, language, and a different kind of power. The French court was a place of refinement, politics hidden beneath manners, and ambition veiled by poetry. Mary flourished intellectually and culturally. She spoke multiple languages, danced with grace, and wrote with lyrical skill. Yet behind the gowns and education, she was being groomed not just as a queen, but as a symbol, one who could bridge kingdoms, faiths, and futures. Her Catholic upbringing in France would later become a fracture line between herself and Protestant Scotland. Her betrothal to the Dauphin, Francis, was the centerpiece of this cross-national grooming. When they married, Mary became queen consort of France, briefly standing on one of Europe's most glittering stages. But this moment of triumph was short-lived. Francis died young, and with him, Mary's place in France faded. She returned to Scotland in 1561, a widow of 18, regal in poise, but politically vulnerable. Scotland had changed. It was not the land she had left. She arrived not as a savior, but as an outsider. Her education and refinement clashed with a country that had taken a sharp turn toward Protestantism. Her elegance seemed foreign. Her Catholicism suspect. The girl who had grown up amidst tapestries and verse now had to rule a land brimming with distrust. It was the beginning of a slow unraveling, a queen crowned too young, caught between two worlds that would never quite welcome her. Mary's return to Scotland placed her at the heart of a kingdom in flux. And soon, her personal choices began to merge uncomfortably with matters of state. Her first marriage after Francis was to her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. It was a union built on shared bloodlines and royal ambition, yet lacking in depth and trust. Darnley was handsome but volatile, charming yet insecure. Their relationship quickly soured. His jealousy of Mary's power grew unbearable, and the marriage spiraled into suspicion and confrontation. In a shocking twist, Darnley was complicit in the murder of Mary's trusted secretary, David Rizzio, right in front of her eyes. It was an act not just of personal betrayal, but of public humiliation. Although Mary stayed briefly by Darnley's side, the bond was shattered. Soon after, Darnley himself was killed, his house blown apart, his body found outside, untouched. By flame but dead nonetheless, into this chaos entered James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Strong, shrewd, and controversial, Bothwell was accused of orchestrating Darnley's murder. And yet, within weeks of Darnley's death, Mary married him. The move shocked her subjects. Whether the marriage was coerced or willing remains a point of debate, but the outcome was clear. Mary's image collapsed under scandal. Nobles rebelled. Protests swelled. And the Queen, once poised and powerful, now stood at the edge of political ruin. In just a few short years, the perception of Mary shifted from a graceful monarch to a woman entangled in a web of intrigue and poor choices. Her marriages had become battlegrounds, her court a theater of betrayal, and her crown, once worn with dignity, now teetered precariously. As the rebellion against her intensified, Mary was forced to flee. She crossed the border into England, hoping to find safety in the court of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. But England was not a sanctuary, it was a gilded prison. Elizabeth saw Mary not as kin, but as a threat. A legitimate Catholic claimant to the English throne, Mary's very presence was politically dangerous. Instead of protection, Mary found confinement. She was held under house arrest, moved from one estate to another over the years, always watched, always silenced. The tapestries were fine, and the meals adequate, but freedom remained a memory. While Mary embroidered, wrote letters, and kept her dignity, she also plotted. Or at least, others plotted in her name. The Babington plot became her undoing. A conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne was uncovered. Whether Mary truly endorsed the plan is still debated, but the evidence intercepted. Letters was damning. For Elizabeth, who had long avoided executing a fellow monarch, the dilemma was no longer avoidable. Mary's captivity had lasted nearly 19 years. Her son, James, whom she had borne in Scotland, had grown into a ruler without her. The world outside had changed. She remained trapped in time, a relic of a different political order, her story unfolding in slow sorrow on a cold February morning. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, walked to her death with composure that startled those who watched. She wore a red petticoat beneath her gown, a color associated with martyrdom. Her execution at Fotheringhay Castle was as ceremonial as it was grim. It marked not only the end of her life, but the closing chapter of a royal drama that had gripped two nations. The axe fell not with swift precision, but with struggle. The first blow missed the neck. The second did not. And when the executioner lifted her head, her wig came off, revealing short gray hair beneath an image as haunting as it was symbolic. The once youthful queen of grace and poetry had aged in captivity. Her life, so full of elegance and turmoil, had come to a tragic, almost theatrical close, but death did not erase her. In fact, it etched her deeper into the memory of history. To Catholics, she became a martyr. To poets, a muse. To historians, a case study in the complexities of female power in a male-dominated world. Mary became more myth than monarch her. Letters, portraits, and legends lingering long after her breath had stilled, her story is a reminder of how fragile thrones can be, and how often personal dignity is sacrificed on the altar of politics. She ruled with grace, stumbled with trust, and died with a kind of peace that eluded her in life. In exile and death, Mary, Queen of Scots, became something larger than herself, a whisper of what monarchy could be, and a shadow of what it too often becomes. Emperor Rudolf to the alchemist king. When Rudolf II rose to power as Holy Roman Emperor in 1576, he held in his hands the brittle unity of Central Europe. The empire stretched across patchworked lands, Catholic and Protestant, German and Slavic, modern and medieval. It needed steady guidance, but Rudolf was no ordinary ruler. He was a man of retreating gestures and inward focus. While others saw the empire as something to manage, he saw it as something that weighed too heavily. Born into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, Rudolf was groomed for greatness, educated in the strict courts of Spain, taught discipline, diplomacy, and the expectations of empire. But beneath this instruction lay a mind more enchanted by mystery than law. He showed early signs of melancholy, periods of silence, and bouts of withdrawal. These traits would become more than quirks. They would shape a reign unlike any before. Upon his ascension, Rudolf moved the imperial court from Vienna to Prague, not for military reasons or governance, but for solitude and vision. Prague was old, mystical, wrapped in fog and legend. It became the stage for a strange kind of kingship, one where the concerns of state faded beneath a fascination with the unknown. The weight of the empire began to loosen in his grip, his. Advisors and nobles, Rudolf was elusive. Decisions were delayed, letters unanswered, laws unsigned. Ministers whispered about his absences, the halls of power echoing with a ruler who often refused to rule. But Rudolf didn't see neglect, he saw purpose. He believed there was more to discover in dreams than in documents, more truth in symbols than in treaties. And so, slowly, the business of empire began to drift. Rudolf's court was unlike any in Europe. It was not a place of battles or budgets, but a sanctuary for stargazers and seekers. He filled his palace with alchemists, magicians, and scholars who believed the universe could be decoded through signs and metals. He invited thinkers like John Dee and Tycho Brahe, giving them space not to govern, but to wonder. Alchemy held special sway over Rudolf. He believed gold could be made from base metals, that the philosopher's stone could grant eternal life. His chambers overflowed with arcane instruments, flasks, crucibles, charts of stars. He studied horoscopes and birth charts, not just of his allies, but of events, empires, and even death. For Rudolf, the world was layered with hidden truths. His collections grew massive, rare books, strange artifacts, paintings filled with allegory. He supported artists who captured mystical visions, who painted not just portraits, but portals into the divine. His court was a museum of the surreal, a place where art, science, and magic blurred into one, but these passions came at a cost. While he chased meaning in stars, rebellion grew in provinces. As he decoded the symbols of forgotten texts, economic woes and political unrest spread. Rudolf was warned, begged even, to return his attention to statecraft. But he would not, or perhaps could not. The occult wasn't a distraction to him. It was a calling. And in that calling, he drifted further from the world he was meant to lead. The absence of order at the top filtered down through every layer of the empire. With no firm hand on policy, factions within the court turned to infighting. Some sought Catholic supremacy, others promoted Protestant reform. With Rudolf unwilling to take a side or even engage, the empire became a boiling pot with no lid. Diplomats left Prague frustrated. Nobles demanded clarity and received silence. Laws were proposed but languished without signature. The machinery of empire, once slow but steady, began to grind into dysfunction. His brother, Matthias, watched from the sidelines, calculating when he might need to step in. Even foreign powers began to see the empire as leaderless. In Rudolph's absence from leadership, superstition gained ground. His fascination with omens crept into official decisions. When wars needed responses, he consulted stars. When cities cried for aid, he searched for symbols in art. Meanwhile, tension between Protestants and Catholics, already tense across Europe, grew combustible within his borders. His court became a metaphor for his rule: grand, curious, and disjointed. Scientists and charlatans mingled in corridors, whispering of secrets and signs. The court was beautiful, but broken, a reflection of the man who built it. Ministers came and went. Policies flickered into and out of relevance. No one, not even Rudolph, seemed to know where power rested anymore. Amid this confusion, one thing became clear: the empire could not hold much longer under a ruler so detached. The dreamer king had turned his back on governance, and his empire began to dream of someone else. As the years passed, Rudolph's withdrawal deepened. He spent more time alone, sometimes refusing to meet with ministers for weeks. Even within the castle walls, he avoided company. His once grand visions faded into private obsessions. His health waned, and so did his influence. In 1608, his brother, Matthias, seized control of much of the empire. It wasn't a coup exactly, but a quiet shift of authority. Rudolph resisted, clinging to Prague and a few symbolic titles, but the reins of empire had passed. He remained in his chambers, surrounded by shadows and memory. He was now a king in name only, his court reduced, his audience gone. The alchemists and magicians drifted away. The artists stopped coming. The halls that once echoed with philosophy and promise now sat silent. Prague, once his jewel, seemed to fold inward with him. In 1612, Rudolph too died. There was no great fanfare, no triumphant procession. He left behind no heirs, no strong legacy of political achievement. But he left a myth, a tale of a ruler who believed more in what could be imagined than what could be ruled. A king who chased mysteries instead of mandates. And in that quiet, curious failure, he became unforgettable. His legacy lies in the tension between wonder and responsibility. Rudolph ruled as a visionary, but his vision was inward. He built a palace of dreams, but let the empire unravel outside its walls. And in the end, his story whispers through history, not as a warning, but as a question. What happens when a king would rather wonder than reign? Queen Ranavalina, the isolation of Madagascar. In the early 19th century, Madagascar stood at a crossroads. Its vast landscapes and ancient traditions held deep strength, but foreign interests began to knock at its shores. Amid this tension, a woman emerged, not from the most obvious line of succession, but from a place of quiet determination. Ranavalina, wife of the deceased King Radama I, was not expected to rule. Yet, through political maneuvering and support from military allies, she seized the throne. Her ascent was not just a claim to leadership, it was a declaration. She would protect her kingdom from foreign influence, no matter the cost. From the start, Ranavalina positioned herself as a guardian of Malagasy tradition. European missionaries, merchants, and envoys had gained a foothold during her husband's reign. Ranavalina saw these outsiders not as partners, but as threats to her people's way of life. Her first years were marked by a steady purge of those loyal to European ideals. Churches were shuttered, and missionaries were expelled or forced underground. Ranavalina's message was clear: Madagascar would not bow. This fierce rise did not go unnoticed. Her court was filled with both admiration and fear. Nobles whispered. Foreigners watched with growing unease. But the queen pressed on. To her, Independence meant more than treaties and trade, it meant isolation. And she believed isolation would preserve the soul of her nation. Ranavalona's determination to protect Madagascar took on a darker tone as her reign continued. Her resistance to foreign influence turned inward, becoming a rule marked by harsh laws and brutal punishments. Trials by ordeal returned. Suspected traitors were forced to walk across red-hot iron or drink poison to prove their innocence. Fear seeped into daily life as rumors of disloyalty could cost one their life. Tens of thousands were executed during her reign. Even more died from forced labor or punitive military campaigns. The Queen believed these harsh measures were necessary to cleanse the nation of corruption, to root out those who threatened the purity of her vision. Entire villages were uprooted. Loyalty was demanded, and dissent was met with silence or death. Cultural practices were also reshaped. Christianity was outlawed. Practicing the new faith in secret meant risking one's life. Schools founded by missionaries were closed, replaced by instruction in traditional Malagasy values. The Queen wanted a nation that reflected only its own soul, free from foreign contamination. To outsiders, she became a figure of horror, a woman whose cruelty defied comprehension. But within Madagascar, views were more complex. Some saw her as a necessary evil, a fierce mother protecting her children from the creeping poison of colonialism. Others lived in quiet fear, caught between pride in their sovereignty and terror of their sovereign, despite the tightening grip of European powers in Africa during the 19th century. Ranavalona refused to allow foreign control to take root in Madagascar. She defied treaties, rejected diplomats, and expelled foreign traders. French and British envoys who had once held influence were marginalized or outright banned. The Queen knew that behind friendly faces lay ambitions of conquest. This defiance came at a steep cost. While other African nations engaged in trade and gained access to new technologies, Madagascar remained isolated. Economically, the island suffered. Without external alliances or support, infrastructure weakened. Internal communication faltered. Roads and ports decayed. Yet Ranavalona seemed unmoved. Her army, still large by regional standards, became her tool for resisting pressure. When French envoys attempted to enforce demands, she responded with shows of force. There were no full invasions during her reign, but skirmishes and tensions remained constant. The Queen sent a message not only to Europe, but to her own people. Madagascar would not be sold or softened. Her defiance extended to ideology. She believed that Western ideas weakened traditional authority. Colonialism began not with soldiers, she said, but with preachers and teachers. So she struck first. By closing schools and forbidding Western customs, she built walls against more than just armies. She built walls against thought. Ranavalona ruled Madagascar for more than 3 decades. When she died in 1861, the island was poorer, quieter, and deeply scarred. But it was also still independent. No foreign flag flew above its capital. No colonial ruler sat on her throne. For that, some call her a hero. Historians remain divided. Some see her as one of the most tyrannical rulers in African history. Others view her as a rare symbol of anti-colonial resistance, a woman who held back the tide longer than almost anyone else. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Her policies preserved culture, but destroyed lives. Her pride defended borders, but isolated minds. The nation she left behind was sovereign, but shattered. It would not be long before Madagascar fell under foreign control. But for a time, one woman's will kept the world at bay. Today, statues of Ranavalona still stand in some parts of Madagascar. Others call for their removal. Her name evokes both pride and pain. She remains a paradox, the queen who ruled with an iron heart, yet held back empires. Her silence echoes in the forests, her shadow lingers on palace stones, and in the quiet hours of the night, when wind stirs the leaves of history, her tale whispers through time, a story not just of power and cruelty, but of a nation's desperate bid to remain its own. King Leopold II, the tyrant of the Congo, in the heart of Africa, beneath the swaying canopies of the Congo Basin, a quiet empire was born, not one forged by armies or national pride, but by a single man's ambition. King Leopold II of Belgium cloaked his private claim to the Congo in the noble language of philanthropy. He called it the Congo Free State, a realm supposedly committed to abolishing slavery and bringing progress. Maps shaded it in Belgian colors, but it belonged to no nation. It was his alone. Leopold had never stepped foot in this land when he secured international recognition for his claim in the late 19th century. The Berlin Conference, convened by European powers to carve up Africa, gave him the blessing he needed. With the stroke of a pen, vast forests, rivers, and millions of people became property. The world heard stories of schools, railways, and hospitals. But those were illusions, carefully crafted for Western eyes. In reality, Leopold's empire was built on rubber. As industrial nations clamored for this new, flexible commodity, the Congo's vines and trees became a treasure trove. But the jungle did not yield easily, and Leopold's agents turned to the people. Under the Force Publique, a brutal paramilitary force, villages were ordered to meet rubber quotas or face punishment. The Congo Free State, despite its name, became a prison of fear. Those who resisted were whipped with shikot, strips of dried hippo hide that tore flesh. Those who failed to collect enough rubber saw their homes burned, families scattered. And in a cruel tally of discipline, soldiers were ordered to provide severed hands as proof that bullets were not wasted. The Congo Free State, in truth, was a harvest of suffering. As the rubber boom grew, so did the horrors. In village after village, families lived in dread of the next patrol. Men were taken as laborers, women held hostage, and children mutilated to ensure obedience. The lush green of the Congo hid scenes of silence and smoke forests echoing with cries and gunshots. The Force Publique, composed of African soldiers led by European officers, acted with impunity. Their mission was not peace but profit. Leopold's officials demanded more rubber, more ivory, more taxes. And as the quotas rose, the violence deepened. Entire communities vanished into the underbrush or were worked to death. An estimated 10 million lives were lost from murder, disease, starvation, or despair. Leopold himself remained distant, seated in his palace in Brussels, surrounded by luxury. He never saw the Congolese faces, never heard their stories. But he counted their toil in francs, building monuments, museums, and lavish estates back home. He was celebrated in Europe as a modernizer, a king of culture and vision, but the Congo told another story. Survivors whispered of villages burned, of fathers shot, of mothers chained to trees. Children who watched their families torn apart carried that memory forever. The jungle's beauty was marred by ghosts. This was not a brief period of cruelty. It lasted for decades. And all the while, Leopold insisted it was civilization. He brought that his rule was a gift. But the truth was carved in wounds, etched in the sorrow of a stolen generation. For years, the Congo's agony remained hidden. Leopold controlled the narrative with skill, hiring publicists and diplomats to defend his name. Photos of model schools and staged ceremonies were circulated to European audiences. His charity work in Belgium gave him an aura of benevolence. But truth, like light through leaves, began to break through, missionaries who lived among the Congolese began to send letters quiet. Reports of brutality and despair. Journalists traveled discreetly, returning with tales of horrors too great to ignore. Chief among them was Ede Morel, a British shipping clerk who noticed something strange. Ships left Belgium for the Congo filled with guns and chains, and returned. Heavy with rubber and ivory, but never carried trade goods, Morel launched a crusade. With his pen as his weapon, he wrote articles, gave speeches, and exposed the systematic exploitation. Alongside him, diplomat Roger Casement journeyed to the Congo and produced a chilling report, filled with eyewitness testimonies. Slowly, the civilized world turned its gaze. Public outrage stirred. The Congo Reform Association grew in numbers, and pressure mounted. Writers, priests, and politicians called for change. The outcry could no longer be silenced by polished speeches or marble statues. In 1908, under immense international pressure, Leopold was forced to hand over the Congo to the Belgian state. But the scars remained, and the transition did not immediately end the suffering. What had begun as a king's private adventure had become one of the earliest human rights movements. For the first time, people spoke collectively against imperial cruelty. It was a whisper, then a wave. The world had noticed Dodd in the twilight of his life. Leopold tried to cleanse his legacy. He ordered the burning of archives, the destruction of personal letters, and sought to bury the truth beneath a mountain of monuments. Statues rose in Belgian squares, praising his contributions to art, architecture, and progress. But history had already begun to take notes. To many in Belgium, Leopold was still a visionary king. Streets bore his name. His face adorned coins. But in the Congo, he was remembered differently. Generations passed down the stories of forests that swallowed fathers, of empty villages where children once played. Oral history preserved what he tried to erase. Even today, the debate over his legacy stirs emotion. Some defend him as a product of his time. Others name him among history's most brutal colonizers. In Kinshasa and Brussels, memories divide and bind. Monuments have been vandalized, plaques removed, discussions reopened. What is clear, however, is the cost. The Congo Free State left behind broken families, lost languages, and a deep mistrust of foreign rule. It stunted progress and warped futures. And while Leopold enriched himself beyond imagination, millions paid the price in blood. In quiet corners of Congo, trees still grow over old paths. Rivers run as they always did. But beneath the calm is a history not forgotten, a warning told through silence, a shadow stretching across continents. This chapter ends not with vengeance, but with remembrance. For history, softly told, still holds its power. And Leopold's story remains a dark reflection of ambition unchecked and empathy undone. Ramses II, the eternal builder with a questionable heart, in the golden light of the Egyptian sun, the world of Ramses II gleamed with pride. Across the desert sands and along the banks of the Nile, colossal statues stood still, unmoving, yet deafening in their message. Here stood Ramses, lord of the two lands. His image was carved with the same calm expression, unblinking eyes, a serene smile, arms crossed in pharaonic confidence. From Luxor to Abu Simbel, the temples spoke with stone voices, not of gods, but of a man who dared to see himself among them. During his long reign, one of the longest in ancient Egyptian history, Ramses II commissioned more monuments than perhaps any other pharaoh before or after. The scale was overwhelming. Entire cities seemed to rise from the dust under his command. The Ramesseum, his mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile, was designed as a tribute to his greatness. But it was not alone. He built temples for gods, yes, but always with his name etched deeply into the stone. Always with his face repeated again and again, larger than life. One cannot walk through the great halls of Karnak without noticing the shift. Older pillars honor the gods with quiet dignity. Ramses' additions, by contrast, bear inscriptions that glorify his might. They do not whisper of faith. They shout of power. The temple at Abu Simbel, carved directly into a mountainside, features 4 seated statues of Ramses himself, each over 60 feet tall. Inside, gods are present, but Ramses is central. In that sacred place, it is hard to tell where man ends and deity begins. Even his tomb was a work of audacity. Though less well preserved than some of his temples, it too spoke of permanence, of a man who expected the earth to remember him forever. Yet, beneath the towering facades and grand statues lies a quiet question. Why such urgency to be remembered? Why did a ruler so powerful feel the need to write his name in every stone? Was it legacy or fear of being forgotten? As the centuries passed, his buildings endured, but so did the whispers of historians who saw in his stone smile not only strength, but a shadow of insecurity. Among the grand tales that Ramses too told about himself, none was repeated with more pride than the Battle of Kadesh. It was a moment meant to define him, a stage where he could stand as warrior, hero, and king. But, like the rest of his image, the truth is more complex. The battle took place around 1274 BCE near the city of Kadesh, in modern-day Syria. Ramses led the Egyptian forces against the Hittite Empire, a powerful rival from the north. What unfolded was one of the largest chariot battles in history, involving thousands of warriors on both sides. The ground shook with hooves and wheels. Spears flew through dust-choked air. Ramses' official account painted him in glowing light. In temple carvings and hieroglyphs, he is shown standing alone, shield in hand, fending off enemies with divine fury. He wrote that his army was scattered, that he alone turned the tide, and that the Hittites were driven back in fear. It is a story of courage and impossible strength of a king blessed by the gods, but modern historians have a different view. They note that the battle likely ended in a stalemate. Ramses may have been caught in a tactical misstep early on, ambushed by the Hittites due to misinformation or overconfidence. His survival and the survival of his army likely depended on reinforcements arriving just in time. The treaty that followed, one of the first known peace treaties in history, was mutual, not a declaration of victory. The Egyptians and Hittites agreed to cease fighting, neither side claiming complete success. Yet, in every inscription that followed, Ramses ignored the nuance. He turned an indecisive engagement into a legendary triumph. On the walls of his temples, the story repeated endlessly. He was not content with history, he wanted myth. And so, he became a god of war in his own narrative. Still, even in the exaggeration, there is a certain brilliance. Ramses understood the power of storytelling. He knew that people remember what is carved in stone, not whispered in caution. The Battle of Kadesh may not have been a win, but in the art of legacy, he won outright. His version remains engraved. Deeply across Egypt's temples dot in the quiet night, when wind brushes the stones of Abu Simbel, one might imagine those battle scenes flickering in torchlight. A king rides alone. His enemies fall. And far from truth, a legend is born, crafted by the man who needed it most. As Ramses raised his monuments and etched his victories, the common people toiled in silence. They hauled stone under scorching sun, shaped blocks with blistered hands, and carved images of a man they would never meet. While the name Ramses soared high on temple walls, theirs faded into dust, unwritten and unsung, the great works of the Pharaoh demanded great labor. Tens of thousands were conscripted to serve the state's ambition. Though Egypt had a structured labor system, with food and lodging provided for many workers, the burden was still immense. Lives were measured not in joy or ease, but in tasks completed and orders obeyed. Life for the average Egyptian during Ramses' reign was not gilded. Farmers worked Nile's edge, timed to the river's cycle. Their harvests were heavily taxed, feeding the state's needs and temple rituals. Soldiers served far from home, building not just walls but borders. Craftsmen and artisans, though respected, lived under tight control. Their work bore Ramses' face, not theirs, the grandeur of. His reign masked the growing distance between ruler and ruled. While temples gleamed with new paint and gold, villages faced floods, disease, and famine. Ramses, with his court and royal wives, over 100 of them, by some accounts lived in comfort. But how many children went hungry beneath the shadow of his monuments? Even in death, disparity remained. Ramses had tombs, tombs within tombs, and a sarcophagus fit for a god. Most Egyptians were buried with only a shroud and a prayer. In a world so focused on eternity, the lives of ordinary people passed quietly, known only to family and gods. This is not to say Ramses was hated. Many saw him as strong, as a protector of Egypt. His image inspired awe. But awe is not the same as love. And a nation can respect its king while still suffering under his dreams. As we admire the stone statues and marvel at temple reliefs, we must also pause. Who carved these wonders? Whose hands shaped the king's legacy? History too often honors the few while forgetting the many. The people who lived, worked, and died during Ramses' reign did so mostly without choice, and often without thanks. In the stillness of the desert night, when wind moves through the broken stones of forgotten homes, perhaps their voices still linger. Not loud, not grand but steady. They tell a quieter story. One of sweat, sacrifice, and the cost of greatness. Ramses' name endures like the Nile itself, long, winding, and seemingly eternal. His statues still rise against the desert sky. His temples still hold their breath in the heat of day and cool of night. His name, Usermiate Setipinri, is etched deeper than most. But what of the man behind the stone? He ruled for over 6 decades, a rare stretch even by ancient standards. He outlived many of his wives and sons. His later years were marked not by conquest, but by ceremony processions, offerings, and the careful shaping of his myth. He saw himself as a god-king, but he was still human. He aged. He limped. He died, his mummy, found centuries later in a hidden tomb, tells a different tale than his monuments. His body was once strong, but grew frail. Arthritis bent his back. Worn teeth spoke of long years. His face, preserved in linen and resin, shows a king who had lived perhaps longer than he ever expected. The truth is this: the image lasted longer than the man. While his memory was kept alive in stone, the reality of his rule faded. Later pharaohs reused his statues, scraping off his name to write their own. His temples fell to ruin. His tomb was robbed, his body moved to safety by priests who feared desecration. The god-king became cargo in a wooden box, shuffled through history like a relic. Yet there is something haunting in how well his image survived. He wanted to be remembered, and he was. Not just in Egypt, but across the world. School books, museums, documentaries all repeat his name. Ramses the Great, but behind that greatness lies a mirror. What does it mean to be remembered? If your name lasts, but your people are forgotten, is that legacy or loneliness? His rule was marked by stability, yes, but also by spectacle. Peace, yes, but also pretense. He ruled not with iron, but with image. In a way, Ramses too gave us a lesson. In memory, not everything carved in stone is truth. Not every grand thing is good. And sometimes the loudest name leaves the quietest legacy. As we close the chapter on his reign, we leave behind statues that still stand tall and stories that still echo in chambers of time. His was a mortal rule wrapped in immortal ambition. A king who looked to the heavens but walked, in the end, like all of us upon the same earth. Ashoka, the great peace after the sword, in the early years of his reign. Ashoka was not called the Great. He was called Ashoka, the Fierce, a ruler of the Maurya Empire in ancient India. He came to power through ambition and strength. His empire stretched across most of the Indian subcontinent, a vast land of rivers, forests, and cities bound under one crown. But peace was not its foundation. It was forged through battles, and none would mark his soul more deeply than the war with Kalinga. Kalinga was a prosperous region, rich in culture and trade, but it had resisted Mauryan control. Ashoka, determined to bring it under his rule, launched an invasion. What followed was a war not of swift conquest, but of brutal resistance. The people of Kalinga fought with everything they had: men, women, even monks joining in defense of their homeland. When the dust settled, Kalinga had fallen. But the price was heavy. According to Ashoka's own later writings, over 100,000 people were killed. Another 150,000 were taken captive. The land was soaked in sorrow. Villages burned. Families shattered. Survivors wandered among ashes, their lives broken by war. Ashoka walked the battlefield afterward, not as a victor celebrating glory, but as a man stunned by silence. The dead lay not only on the ground, but in his heart. He had won the war, but he had lost something else, something deeper than power could replace. That moment would mark the turning point of his life. For a man known for cruelty and conquest, the war with Kalinga became the mirror he could not turn away from. He saw, in the eyes of the conquered, a reflection of his own emptiness. And though the empire expanded, something within Ashoka began to retreat. The Kalinga War was more than just a historical event. It was a scar across a king's legacy, a chapter of pain written in blood and grief. It revealed the terrible cost of ambition and lit the first spark of change. Not immediately, not easily, but deeply. A conqueror had everything except peace, and in that quiet reckoning, the story of Ashoka, the Great, truly began. In the shadow of the Kalinga War, Ashoka turned inward. The roar of battle faded. In its place came silence, then seeking. The man who once moved armies now sat in contemplation. Something had shifted. He began to question the meaning of power, of rule, of life itself. A T was then that Ashoka encountered the teachings of Buddhism, not as a state religion, not as conquest, but as comfort. The Buddha's words spoke of suffering, of compassion, of inner peace. They offered no palaces or titles, only a path. Ashoka embraced this path with quiet intensity. He did not renounce his throne, but he reshaped it. Instead of ruling through fear, he would try to rule through dharma, a word that means truth, virtue, and moral duty. Dharma became his new guide, a compass not of conquest, but of conscience. He gave up hunting. He stopped the forced labor of prisoners. He reduced harsh punishments. He visited holy sites, not as a king making claims, but as a student walking among memories. In his court, he welcomed people of all faiths, allowing freedom of thought. A rare gift for the time, his change was not loud. It was steady. real. Not everyone believed it at first. After all, this was the same man who once crushed cities. But Ashoka seemed less interested in convincing others and more focused on living the truth himself. He also began to share the teachings, not as a preacher, but as a witness. He sent missionaries across his empire and beyond to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, even as far as the Mediterranean. Not to convert by force, but to speak of compassion, patience, and kindness. Ashoka's embrace of Buddhism was not about politics. It was about redemption. He had seen suffering caused it, and now wished to relieve it, even in small ways. He understood that peace was not a single moment, but a lifelong choice. In turning toward Dharma, Ashoka did something rare for rulers of any age. He admitted his past, and he changed. He chose humility over pride, reflection over dominance. And though his empire still held power, its heart began to soften. It would never erase Kalinga. But in its place, something else began to grow, a different kind of greatness. One not carved with swords, but with silence, sincerity, and sorrow. Transformed, Ashoka's transformation was not just personal. It became policy. His vision for the empire changed, not with new borders, but with new values. He ruled not only to protect his people, but to guide them, to show what it meant to live rightly, to choose empathy over ego. He began by spreading messages literally. Across his empire, stone pillars were raised. Edicts were carved in simple language so anyone could understand them. These were not commands of war or boasts of victory. They were quiet lessons, shared in stone. The pillars spoke of patience, tolerance, kindness to animals, and care for the poor. They advised against greed. They promoted respect for other faiths. They even urged officials to be humble and fair. These were not just royal wishes. They were blueprints for a better way of life. Ashoka created a new role in his government, officers of Dharma. Their job was to travel, listen to people, help settle conflicts peacefully, and ensure that the spirit of compassion reached even the smallest village. In his own court, Ashoka met with common people regularly. He wanted to hear their voices, not only those of the elite. He funded hospitals for people and animals. He planted trees and built wells along roads to offer rest and water to travelers. His focus turned from expansion to care, from fear to trust. Of course, not all was perfect. Some officials resisted. Some people doubted. After all, peace is harder to manage than war. It requires patience, not power. Still, Ashoka held firm. He believed that leading by example was stronger than leading by force. His choice to embrace nonviolence did not mean the empire became weak. Instead, it became a symbol of something rare: strength with gentleness. A powerful nation led not by swords, but by the hope of peace. Even today, the memory of this leadership remains unusual. Kings and emperors are often remembered for what they conquered. Ashoka, instead, is remembered for what he gave up and what he tried to heal. In choosing to rule by example, Ashoka reminded the world that change is possible, even at the highest level, that a ruler can grow, that a nation can become kinder not through fear, but through care. His story shows us that power, when held with purpose, can build something softer, something enduring. Long after Ashoka's death, the empire he built would fade. Boundaries would change. Rulers would rise and fall. The Maurya dynasty, so powerful in its prime, would crumble in time. But something of Ashoka remained, not in gold or conquest, but in stone. His pillars still stand, scattered across the Indian subcontinent. Tall, quiet, weathered by time. Their messages, carved more than 2,000 years ago, still whisper of peace, still urge kindness, still ask for understanding. They are not only historical artifacts. They are echoes of a man who changed and who wanted that change to matter. Some of these pillars were lost for centuries, buried or broken. When rediscovered, their words surprised many. A king had once ruled not with threats, but with thoughts, not with armies, but with compassion. And though his story had been forgotten in books, it lived on in stone, but stone tells only part of the story. Beneath the peaceful words lies the truth of Ashoka's past, the war in Kalinga, the lives lost, the suffering caused. His legacy is not simple. It is layered. He was both destroyer and healer, both sword and salve. This duality is what makes his story powerful. It shows that change is not clean, that redemption does not erase but transforms. Ashoka did not pretend he had always been kind. He did not hide his mistakes. Instead, he used them. He turned pain into purpose. In this, his pillars are not monuments to perfection, but to progress. They show that a person, even one with great power and deep faults, can become better. That legacy is not only what we build, but what we repair today. Ashoka's emblem, the lion capital from one of his pillars, is the national symbol of India. His story, once forgotten, is now taught in schools, remembered in museums, and honored in silence, and yet one question lingers. Was it enough? Was Ashoka's change too late to undo the damage he had done? Perhaps. But maybe that's not the only measure. Perhaps the measure is that he changed it all, that he looked at the blood on his hands and chose to wash them, not with denial, but with action. As the sun sets over the worn stones of his pillars, there is no triumph, no anthem, just stillness, a soft breeze, and a king's voice, carved in time, reminding us the greatest strength may lie not in conquest, but in the courage to seek peace and to live it. The Sun King's shadow, Louis Ziv, the court of Louis XIV, shimmered like no other in Europe. Draped in silk and laced with gold, it dazzled the senses. At its heart stood Versailles, a palace not merely built, but sculpted into a living symbol of splendor. The halls echoed with the soft shuffle of embroidered shoes and whispered envy. Mirrors stretched across vast galleries, reflecting chandeliers, painted ceilings, and faces carefully arranged in the light. Louis XIV was not just a king. He was Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King. Around him revolved the very idea of France. His clothing, ceremonies, and every movement were crafted to project power and majesty. Mornings began with the ritual of the lever, where nobles watched him wake, dress, and greet the day. Even his rising from bed became a performance of status and awe. Versailles itself was a mask, a glowing golden surface meant to shield the truth. There, art and architecture conspired to build the illusion of perfection. Fountains danced on command. Gardens bloomed in symmetrical harmony. Court life followed unspoken rules of attention and flattery. Power belonged not to armies or ministers, but to proximity. To be close to Louis was to exist. This world of appearance was carefully designed. It subdued the nobility, who were once rivals for power. By drawing them into endless rituals, the king kept them preoccupied and dependent. They dressed by his side, waited for his glance, and competed for moments in his shadow. The palace became a stage, and Louis its ever-burning light, yet behind the glow lay strategy. Louis understood that image could rule hearts more deeply than fear. His reign was marked by the belief that if the king seemed eternal, then France itself could never fall. The mask of Versailles was not deception alone. It was a vision bold, radiant, and captivating, but masks, no matter how golden, are still masks. As the music played and the mirrors gleamed, something quieter stirred beneath. For all its grace, the court was not peace. It was pressure. It was cost. And as the world outside Versailles changed, the image inside remained stubbornly. Still, beyond the grand gates of Versailles, France bore the weight of Louis's dreams. The golden halls may have glowed, but across the countryside, life was not so gilded. Taxes climbed higher each year. Wars bled the treasury dry. Fields once green turned fallow as men were conscripted, and families were left to cope with hunger. Fear and loss. Louis's ambition reached far beyond palace walls. He fought numerous wars to expand France's borders and assert its dominance in Europe. These campaigns, costly and often inconclusive, left a trail of hardship. The War of Spanish Succession, in particular, dragged on for years, draining lives and silver alike. Soldiers returned broken, or not at all. Towns suffered under repeated levies, their people weary of promises wrapped in glory home. The king's centralization of power reshaped France. Local nobles, once leaders of their regions, were replaced with appointed officials loyal to Versailles. This gave Louis control, but it also stifled local voice. Laws became distant. Justice felt far away. What the court called order, the provinces often felt as silence. Religion too became a tool of control. Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes, removing protections for Protestants. What followed was persecution, exile, and fear. France lost skilled workers and thinkers. What seemed like religious unity came at the cost of cultural fracture. The cost of Versailles itself was immense. Its construction and maintenance drained public funds. While fountains flowed in the palace gardens, villagers carried water in buckets from distant wells. Silk draped the royal halls, while linen grew rare in peasant homes. The very splendor of the Sun King rested on the invisible labor of countless hands and the overlooked suffering of those far from the center. Still, the illusion held. Many believed in the glory because they had little else. The court continued. Its rituals. Artists painted victories that history would later question. Musicians played as fields emptied. The king stood tall in his shoes, each pair custom-made, each step choreographed, but beneath the glamour, France was changing. Slowly, quietly, the foundation trembled. Not yet a collapse, but a strain. A whisper behind the music, the kind only silence can hear. Louis XIV believed in legacy, not just in being remembered, but in being remembered as great. His decisions often followed this single guiding light to secure an image that would never fade. And yet, in doing so, he added weight to a crown already heavy with history. His need for control reached deep into the lives of his subjects. Bureaucracy grew thick with forms and favors. Officials answered upward, not outward. Every success, every festival, was tied to the king's name. Even failure, if it occurred, was quietly wrapped in stories that protected the image. But ego does not remain unseen. It shapes policies that serve image over outcome. Louis sought to leave a mark so large that none could rival it. He expanded the military not only for defense, but for display. He spent fortunes on architecture, not only for beauty, but for boasting. And when voices questioned the cost, they were often ignored or replaced. The king believed that France was strong because he was strong. But this belief blinded him to the cracks growing at his feet. His long reign over 70 years brought stability, yes, but it also created stagnation. Ideas that did not match the court's vision were pushed aside. Innovation gave way to imitation. France became a mirror of one man's dream, instead of a living, breathing nation of many voices. In his later years, Louis grew more pious. He regretted some of his earlier decisions. He mourned lost children, lost battles, and perhaps even the cold distance he had created between himself and his people. But the image remained. He could not or would not let it go. His legacy, though grand, became a burden. To keep the illusion alive, others had to sacrifice. He built a nation that seemed eternal, but at a cost that few could bear for long. His death in 1715 was not just the end of a life, it was the soft dimming of a flame that had cast both light and shadow. Ego, in the end, does not disappear. It lingers in choices made, in systems left behind, in silences that grow louder. With time, Louis XIV built a stage so brilliant that many forgot to question what lay behind the curtain. But history, eventually, lifts the veil, and what it found was not just power but pressure. Not just grandeur but grief. When the Sun King passed away, Versailles did not fall. The mirrors still shone. The fountains still danced. The palace, like his memory, endured. But France, beneath the surface, had changed. The weight of Louis XIV's reign had carved deep grooves, some glorious, others grave. His successors struggled with the system he left behind. The state was rich in image, but poor in coin. The nobility remained distant from the people. The centralization he prized had removed many local bonds. What followed was a slow erosion of stability, a soft unraveling that would, in time, lead to revolution. Yet, his achievements cannot be denied. Louis strengthened France's identity. He championed the arts, established institutions, and left behind a cultural imprint that defined an era. Even today, his taste, style, and ceremonies echo through museums, operas, and history books, but alongside the admiration walks a question: what is the cost of glory? If splendor masks struggle, can it still be called success? Louis XIV proved that a single vision, held tightly enough, can shape a nation. But he also showed that the shadows cast by greatness are not easily escaped. In every room of Versailles, one sees his reflection. In every law shaped to his will, his voice remains. His story is not just of a king, but of what happens when one man becomes the symbol of an entire nation. The risk is that when he falls, the whole image trembles, and yet there is beauty in the complexity. His reign was not pure triumph or total failure. It was both. It was the golden mask and the tired face beneath. It was celebration and strain. It was a lesson in power and in its limits. Today, visitors walk Versailles in quiet wonder. They look up at the painted ceilings, walk the long hall of mirrors, and imagine the world that once lived there. They see the shine. But if they listen, they might hear something softer beneath the echo of footsteps, the murmur of doubts, the weight of a shadow that never fully left. Louis XIV's legacy remains suspended between admiration and warning, between light and loss. And in that space, his story continues to whisper that even the brightest sun leaves darkness behind. Tyranny in Tudor read Henry V. At the height of his reign, Henry VIII was more than a king, he was a spectacle. Broad-shouldered and bold, he commanded attention wherever he stood. Dressed in layers of velvet, gold, and jewels, he was the very image of royal might. His court followed suit, mirroring his appetite for power, pleasure, and pageantry. In Tudor England, no figure loomed larger than the king. The court at Hampton and Whitehall was a living theater of wealth. Music echoed through carved halls. Feasts stretched late into the night, filled with roasted game, fine wine, and whispers of favor. Artists painted his image with care, capturing not just his likeness, but the myth he carefully shaped strong. Wise, unchallengeable, Henry was not simply a ruler of land. He sought to be a Renaissance prince, a man of letters, sports, and strategy. He jousted with fierce pride, wrote poetry in quiet moments, and surrounded himself with thinkers who praised his learning. He saw himself as a king touched by greatness. Equal to the grand monarchs of Europe, destined to shape more than just policy, but history itself, his court reflected his hunger for legacy. Architects were summoned to design grand palaces. Scholars debated religion and power under his gaze. Nobles competed for his smile. And yet, beneath the elegance was a tension, the awareness that everything at court revolved around one man's moods, desires, and decisions. It was a shining world, but one that flickered easily. Still, there was brilliance. England became more visible on the world stage. Trade flourished. Music, literature, and art bloomed under royal patronage. For a time, Henry's rule seemed filled with possibility, a new era built in his name. A kingdom crafted in his image, but behind the royal charm, something deeper stirred. Ambition would soon clash with reality. Love would turn into strategy. And the dazzling surface of the court would give way to shadows cast by doubt, betrayal, and blood. Henry V's need for an heir would ignite a storm. 6 wives would come and go, each shaping history in their own way. But it was his first. Marriage and his desire to end it, that would divide a nation. Married to Catherine of Aragon for over 2 decades, Henry had no surviving sons. Only a daughter, Mary. He began to believe, or at least claim, that the marriage was cursed, unnatural. But more than belief was driving him. There was Anne Boleyn, bright and sharp, who captured his attention and held it. Henry wanted to marry her. The church said no. The Pope's refusal to grant an annulment sparked something irreversible. Henry, unwilling to be denied, broke away. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy declared him the supreme head of the Church of England. The Reformation had arrived, not born from theology, but from the heart of a king who could not accept refusal. It was a religious earthquake. Monasteries were dissolved. Land was seized. Priests swore loyalty to the crown, or they vanished. Ancient rituals were silenced. New ideas crept in, some embraced, others feared. For ordinary people, the change was confusing, disorienting. Faith, once constant, became political. Anne Boleyn became queen, but the joy was brief. She, too, failed to deliver a son. She was accused of adultery, witchcraft, and treason. In 1536, she was executed. Henry married again and again. Jane Seymour gave him the son he longed for, but died shortly after. Anne of Cleves came and went. Catherine Howard was beheaded. Catherine Parr survived. Each wife's story added new cracks to Henry's reign. Each loss shifted the courts. Balance. What had begun as a pursuit of love and legacy became a trail of broken hearts and sharpened axes. The Church of England, meanwhile, was here to stay. Though its beliefs evolved slowly, its existence rewrote England's future. And at its center stood Henry, not a priest, not a scholar, but a king who rewrote the rules because he could. It was bold. It was devastating. It changed the face of religion forever. As Henry aged, the vibrancy of his youth faded. Injuries from jousting left him in pain. His once athletic body grew heavy. His temper darkened. The confident king who once dazzled now ruled from a place of fear. The court, once full of song and flirtation, shifted into silence and suspicion. Old friends became threats. Advisors came and went, their loyalty tested not by wisdom, but by survival. Thomas More, once his trusted thinker, was executed. So was Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the Reformation. Even Henry's own wives were not safe. 2 had died by his order. Others had narrowly escaped. He trusted fewer and fewer people. Even those closest to him walked carefully. Words were weighed, eyes avoided. The court became a place of performance, not celebration. Nobles watched each other, wondering who would fall next. Henry's policies became harsher. Dissent was not debated, it was crushed. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a rebellion sparked by anger over religious changes, was put down with brutal force. Executions multiplied. Heads fell for words once spoken in passing, and still Henry was not at peace. His mind turned inward. He worried about succession, betrayal, and the legacy he would leave behind. His paranoia grew like ivy around his throne, tightening until even shadows felt like enemies. Despite his fears, Henry remained powerful. Few dared oppose him. But that power was laced with loneliness. He had lost friends, wives, and perhaps even parts of himself. The crown had become both a shield and a prison dot in his final years. He was more memory than man feared, not adored. His once golden court now dimmed, its rituals stiff with worry. The laughter had gone. Only the sound of footsteps on stone remained quiet, careful, cold. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he left behind a kingdom forever changed. His desires for love, for sons, for power had shaped laws, faith, and lives. The court mourned him, but also exhaled. His will had ruled every corner of the realm. Now there was space to think, to breathe. His legacy was complex. The Church of England stood firm, a monument to his defiance. But so did the damaged religious confusion, political divisions, families broken by loyalty and loss. What had once been unity was now a patchwork of wounds and reforms. None fully healed. His daughter Mary would try to undo his changes. His daughter Elizabeth would later secure them. His son Edward, so dearly longed for, would die young. The royal house carried his legacy, not always with pride. And what of the people? The commoners who lived through the swing of churches, the rise and fall of queens, the burden of taxes, and the threat of speaking too freely. They remembered a king who was larger than life, but also unpredictable, dangerous. Henry VIII ruled with passion, but also with cruelty. His charm could inspire, but his anger could destroy. He loved fiercely, but discarded those who disappointed. His reign was not just a chapter in history. It was a mirror showing how personal needs can become national law, how private sorrow can turn into public loss. The cost of his reign was not only gold, but trust. Not only lives, but stability. He built and broke with equal force. His greatness was forged in the same fire as his flaws, and yet his story endures. Not because he was kind or wise, but because he was human in a way that shaped a kingdom. His crown carried both glory and grief. His choices echoed long after his voice went silent. As we close this chapter, we do not judge, we reflect on how one man's heart, restless and unyielding, altered the course of a nation, and how behind every throne there beats a heart sometimes bold, sometimes broken, but always capable of changing the world. From philosopher to despot, Marcus Aurelius, in the quiet hours before dawn, while the empire still slept, Marcus Aurelius would often write, not to command armies or pen new laws, but to reflect. His words, meant only for himself, were gentle reminders of humility, patience, and purpose. These writings, later known as Meditations, offered a rare glimpse into the mind of a ruler who sought not glory, but virtue. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor, Yes, but unlike any before. He did not crave spectacle. He was not born into indulgence. Instead, he was shaped by discipline and thought, guided by the ancient philosophy of Stoicism. To him, power was not for pleasure. It was responsibility, a duty to serve the world. Not himself, he ruled during a time of challenge. Plagues swept across provinces. Borders were tested by war. Famine whispered at the edges of cities. Yet, through it all, Marcus remained steady. His leadership was calm, his decisions measured. He believed that reason, not impulse, should guide action even in chaos. The court he kept was not one of lavish excess, but of learned men and honest counsel. He surrounded himself with philosophers, generals, and judges who valued wisdom over flattery. His rule was a quiet force, grounded in thought rather than show on the battlefield. He stood with his soldiers. He did not hide in marble halls, but rode beside them in bitter winters and long marches. He slept in tents, wore the same cloaks, and shared the burdens of command. In this, he earned more than loyalty, he earned respect, but perhaps his greatest gift was how he ruled himself. In an empire of indulgence, Marcus practiced restraint. In a time of ego, he clung to humility. He saw himself not as a master of men, but as a servant of fate. His thoughts often returned to death, not with fear, but acceptance. He reminded himself that even emperors fade, that legacy is less about power and more about peace. Many. He was the last of Rome's good emperors, a philosopher in a time of swords, a man who walked with reason through a world on edge. And yet, even the wisest man can miss what lies closest to home. In the quiet balance of his reasoned rule, Marcus Aurelius made one decision that history still questions. He chose his son, Commodus, as his successor. It was a choice born of tradition, perhaps even hope, but not of wisdom. And in that choice, the philosopher king planted a seed of sorrow. Commodus was born into luxury, the son of an emperor, heir to the world's most powerful empire. But unlike his father, he did not seek books or discipline. He loved spectacle. He admired strength, but not for service for show. As a boy, he was indulged. As a youth, he was proud. And as a man, he would become dangerous. Marcus, ever the thinker, must have seen glimpses of this. He was not blind to flaws, but he believed, perhaps too deeply, in teaching by example. He may have hoped that by modeling virtue, his son would learn it. That patience could tame pride. That reflection could replace impulse, but Commodus was not shaped by philosophy. He was shaped by power. And when Marcus died in 180 CE, the careful world he had crafted began to slip. Commodus took the throne not with humility, but with hunger. He distanced himself from his father's advisors. He ended wars not through strategy, but to claim peace as his own triumph. He named cities after himself. He declared himself a god, and in the arenas of Rome, he fought as a gladiator, not for justice, but for applause. The empire watched as dignity gave way to delusion. Under Commodus, Rome became unstable. Corruption spread. Fear replaced order. And the golden image of Marcus's reign dimmed, overtaken by a son who could not carry its weight. It is one of history's quiet tragedies. A wise father, perhaps, too gentle, too trusting, passed his crown not to a worthy steward, but to a shadow. And that shadow grew. For all his insight, Marcus did not see what many later did, that love is not enough, that legacy requires more than blood, and that even the best intentions can lead to ruin if placed in the wrong hands. Marcus Aurelius believed in reason above all. He believed that clear thought, discipline, and inner calm could guide any man, even a ruler, through chaos. But life, even for a philosopher king, does not always follow reason. Wisdom at its peak still carries the risk of failure. His writings are filled with reminders to accept fate, to master emotion, to do good regardless of reward. And he lived by these words. But one cannot rule alone. Rome was vast, restless, and complex. Beneath his calm leadership were tides of discontent, power struggles, and pressures that no scroll could solve. Marcus tried to hold it all. To govern justly, to fight fairly, to think clearly. Yet, like all men, he was bound by limits of time, of vision, of trust. His stoic heart, so steady in solitude, may not have prepared him for the chaos that others would create in his absence. By appointing Commodus, he made a choice that did not reflect the Rome he had built. It reflected Rome as he wished it to be led by a son molded in virtue. But this hope was more dream than judgment. And in that, wisdom failed. The cracks appeared quickly. The empire began to fracture. Confidence in leadership slipped. Where Marcus had ruled with restraint, Commodus ruled with whim. Where Marcus wrote meditations, Commodus built statues of himself, and the ripple grew. With Commodus came instability. With instability came violence. Rome entered a new age not of reflection, but of unrest. It is tempting to see Marcus as flawless. His words still echo in minds centuries later, speaking of patience, humility, and peace. But even the wisest can falter. Even the calmest minds can misplace their trust. This does not undo his legacy. But it reminds us that knowledge alone does not protect against pain. That clarity of thought cannot shield against the choices of others. And that even the best lives contain moments of misjudgment. Marcus Aurelius was not less great for his failure, only more human. In the years after Marcus's death, Rome would descend into darkness. Commodus's rule ended not in triumph, but in assassination. He was strangled in his chambers, his body discarded by those who could no longer bear his reign. What followed was a time of civil war, of emperors rising and falling like shadows on a wall. The peace Marcus tried to preserve crumbled quickly. And in the ruins, his memory stood like a silent monument, noble. But still, one wonders if, in his final days, the philosopher king felt the tremble of regret. If he sensed that his son would undo what he had built. If he feared that the empire would forget the quiet strength of wisdom and fall again into the noise of ambition. There is no clear record of such thoughts. But his writings grow more somber near the end. He speaks of accepting all things, of letting go, of being part of a larger design. Perhaps in that there was sorrow. Perhaps not, but history remembers. It remembers that Marcus Aurelius stood against the storms of empire with thought, not rage. That he ruled not as a tyrant, but as a servant. That he tried deeply, earnestly to live by truth. And it remembers, too, that his failure was not cruelty, but hope misplaced. His story offers no easy lesson. It is not about perfection. It is about intention, about the fragility of legacy, about how even noble men, with the best minds and kindest hearts, can leave behind damage they never wished. Today, meditation still rests on shelves across the world. Readers turn its pages in quiet rooms, searching for calm. And in that small act, Marcus's voice still speaks soft, steady, searching. He did not claim greatness. He sought goodness. He did not chase immortality. He faced mortality with grace. And though the empire shook after him, his thoughts remained, like stones in a river, steady, grounding, patient. As we close this chapter, we leave Marcus not as a ruler crowned in marble, but as a man who wrote by candlelight asking himself how to live well. His words were not answers. They were reminders, and perhaps that is the best legacy of all. The vanity of power. Augustus. When Julius Caesar fell beneath the knives of senators, the Roman Republic trembled. Chaos spread, old alliances crumbled, and into that uncertainty stepped a young man with quiet eyes and a careful smile. His name was Octavian, but history would come to know him as Augustus from the beginning. Augustus understood something essential about power. It is not always taken by force. Sometimes it is wrapped in silence, presented with gentleness, and offered in the name of the people. Augustus didn't seize the republic, he preserved its shape while replacing its soul. Though he held ultimate control, he never wore the crown of a king. He called himself princeps, or first citizen. He insisted the Senate still ruled. But beneath these titles and gestures, the truth was clear. He commanded the army, controlled the treasury, and made all final decisions. The republic still breathed, but its heart beat only for him. Every reform he made was dressed in tradition. He avoided the mistakes of Caesar, who had pushed too quickly. Augustus moved slowly, cloaked in ceremony. He returned powers to the Senate, only to be begged to keep them. He rejected titles only to accept greater ones later. To the people, he appeared reluctant, even humble. But each step drew him closer to absolute rule. He knew how to be seen and how to disappear. He was not loud. He was not showy. His power was soft and subtle, like water shaping stone. By the time most realized how much he held, it was already normal. The illusion was powerful. It calmed the senators, soothed the citizens, and allowed Rome to believe it had saved itself from tyranny. Yet behind this curtain of republic, a new empire had formed, one that bore his name. One shaped by his hand, Augustus built his rule not by breaking the system, but by wearing its mask. And through that mask, he smiled patient, steady, and unshakable. The republic was not destroyed. It was transformed beneath the quiet footsteps of a man who understood that power, when hidden in plain sight, becomes almost invisible. Augustus ruled not only with laws and legions, but with stories. He knew the power of symbols, of statues, and poetry of myth woven into marble. He understood that truth could be shaped gently and beautifully into something enduring. All across Rome, images of Augustus appeared. He was sculpted as young and strong, even as he aged. Artists carved his face with calm dignity, never anger. He stood beside gods, his profile noble, his robes flowing. These weren't portraits, they were ideals. Coins bore his likeness, spread hand to hand like whispers. Each one reminded citizens who led them, who fed them, who guarded their peace. In every marketplace, his face smiled silently from silver and gold. Poets, too, joined in. Virgil's Aeneid did more than tell a tale. It placed Augustus at the end of a divine destiny, linking him to Aeneas, the legendary founder of Rome. The message was clear. Augustus was not just a ruler. He was a chosen guardian, the fulfillment of fate. Even architecture became part of the vision. Temples were restored. Forums were expanded. A new Rome rose from the old, cleaner, more orderly, and deeply marked with his legacy. The city became his stage, the people his audience. Every column, every road, every festival was touched by his shadow. He also shaped memory. History was rewritten with care. Enemies became villains. Allies became visionaries. Augustus's rise was told not through ambition, but necessity. He had not taken power, he had saved Rome. That was the story. And soon it was the truth everyone remembered. His funeral rites would later reflect this myth-making. He was declared a god by the Senate. A mortal man who had ruled like no other was lifted into eternity, not through divine favor, but through human belief, carefully sculpted over decades. Propaganda in his hands was not loud or crude. It was elegant. It moved slowly, gently reshaping minds until his presence felt natural, eternal. Augustus did not force the people to love him. He built a world where they could not imagine life without him, and in that world, power became something more than command. It became culture, memory, myth. Behind the marble calm of Augustus's rule lay a family torn by grief, ambition, and disappointment. For all his skill in shaping an empire, he struggled to shape an heir. His bloodline, meant to carry his legacy, became a source of sorrow. He married for duty, not love, and his only biological child, Julia, was both a hope and a burden. She was intelligent, witty, and lively, but her private choices clashed with her father's strict moral image. Augustus, who had championed public virtue, could not accept scandal. Julia was exiled. Her name, once sung in court, was hushed. He looked to his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, sons of Julia, groomed from childhood to inherit the empire. Statues were carved in their honor. Speeches celebrated their promise. But fate had other plans. Lucius died first, then Gaius, both young, both far from home. Augustus mourned not just as a ruler, but as a grandfather. The future he had planned vanished in quiet funerals and fading hopes. He turned next to Tiberius, his stepson through marriage to Livia. Tiberius was capable, disciplined but cold, distant and unwilling. Augustus adopted him reluctantly, seeing in him not a dream fulfilled, but a necessity accepted. The transition was uneasy. Tiberius was not loved by the people. He lacked charm, warmth, and connection. But Augustus had little choice. His careful plans had unraveled. What remained was survival, not legacy. The imperial family, so carefully posed in public, cracked in private. Augustus's stepson Drusus died young. His granddaughter was also exiled. Betrayal, illness, and scandal surrounded the house of Caesar. What should have been a dynasty of light became a story of shadows. Through it all, Augustus worked to preserve the image. The statues still stood. The poets still praised. But behind the walls of the Palatine Hill, there were tears, silences, and long nights of doubt. In the end, Augustus gave Rome stability, but he could not give himself peace. His dynasty, though powerful, was born from compromise. Not love, not harmony, just survival, and in that, the great builder of empire discovered something all too human: that control may guide a state. But it cannot always guide the hearts of those closest to us. When Augustus died in 14 CE, his passing was quiet. The man who had ruled for over 4 decades left behind an empire unified, orderly, and rich in appearance. But beneath the surface, there were questions. He had brought peace after civil war. He had ended a century of bloodshed. His rule marked the Pax Romana, a long stretch of relative calm across the vast Roman world. For that, many would praise him. Historians, poets, and citizens would speak of his wisdom, his fairness, his vision. But legacy is not only what is built, it is also what is hidden. Augustus had created stability by removing choice. The Senate still stood, but its power was hollow. Elections were held, but decisions came from above. Freedoms were quietly tucked away, replaced with spectacle and story. The Republic lived in name, not in practice. He built trust through control, unity through silence. And over time, the people accepted it. They traded voice for safety, debate for order. Augustus offered calm, and the empire accepted. perhaps gratefully, perhaps unknowingly, yet the system he left behind was fragile. It depended on the character of one man. When good rulers followed, peace continued. When cruel ones rose, the same system enabled darkness. The empire survived him, but it did not always thrive. The line of emperors would see both visionaries and tyrants. Caligula, Nero, Domitian, each shaped by the tools Augustus had created but wielded without his care, and so his legacy is mixed. He saved Rome, but at a cost. He gave it order by taking away its voice. He inspired loyalty, but demanded obedience. Still, his name endures. His temples still stand. His face still rests on ancient coins. He is remembered as a founder, a restorer, a father of empire, but perhaps the truest memory of Augustus is more complex. A man who mastered appearances, who ruled with brilliance, who built peace through control, and who, in seeking to protect the future, shaped it with quiet vanity. As we close this chapter, we leave behind not a villain nor a saint, but a ruler who changed the world with calm, careful hands. His empire may have been forged in thought, but it was also shaped by silence, and sometimes the gentlest grasp leaves the deepest mark. Empire of the ego. Napoleon Bonaparte. In the final years of the 18th century, France burned with uncertainty. The revolution had swept away the old order, leaving behind a nation without shape, wounded and waiting. Amid the chaos of collapsing monarchy, guillotines, and shifting power, a young man from Corsica began to rise. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, born in 1769. Just months after Corsica was claimed by France, Napoleon was neither noble nor Parisian. He grew up on the edges of empire, an outsider by birth. Yet, even as a boy, he was drawn to strategy, to order, and to ambition that reached far beyond his small island. He trained in French military schools, standing apart with his accent, his silence, and his intense focus. He studied history, mathematics, and tactics, seeing in every map a future campaign, in every lesson a way forward. When the revolution came, it tore down many paths, but it opened one for him. In the 1790s, as France battled itself and its neighbors, Napoleon emerged as a brilliant commander. At just 24, he was named a general. At 26, he led the French army of Italy to a stunning series of victories. With speed, daring, and calculated risk, he outmaneuvered older, more experienced enemies. His soldiers adored him. His enemies feared him, but it wasn't only his battles that made him rise, it was his image. He understood how to be seen. He sent reports back to Paris filled with victories, downplaying losses, framing every step as destiny. Painters captured him on horseback, crossing mountains in theatrical glory. Newspapers told of a new kind of hero not born of royal blood, but of revolutionary fire, and the people believed. They were tired of fear, tired of uncertainty. In Napoleon, they saw clarity. A man who brought victory, order, and promise. A man who could make France proud again. By 1799, he returned to Paris not as a general, but as a political force. He overthrew the shaky government in a swift coup, replacing it with the consulate and himself as first consul. It was not yet an empire, but it was close. In less than a decade, Napoleon had risen from obscurity to rule. He did not seize power through noise. He stepped into a void and filled it completely, but the higher he climbed, the more his reflection began to shape his vision. And the clearer the view became, the harder it was to look down. On a cold December morning in 1804, the doors of Notre Dame de Paris opened to one of history's most symbolic moments. beneath high arches and painted ceilings, surrounded by nobles, clergy, and diplomats, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor. It was a gesture both simple and staggering. The Pope had traveled from Rome to bless the ceremony, expecting to place the crown upon Napoleon's head. But Napoleon, standing tall in white robes and gold trim, took the crown in his own hands and placed it there himself. France and the world watched. He did not need permission. He would not kneel. The revolution had rejected kings, but he became more than one. In that moment, he declared that his authority came not from God, nor tradition, but from himself. The empire had begun under his rule. Power was pulled into a single center. The old revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality were reshaped. Freedom of speech narrowed. Political opposition faded. Newspapers were censored. The law, restructured through the Napoleonic Code, brought order, but it also made him the architect of every rule. Still, he remained wildly popular. He brought stability. He reformed the economy, built roads, revived schools. The chaos of the past faded, replaced with structure. Statues rose. Music played. Crowds cheered. Paris gleamed with new hope, but behind the fanfare was control. He filled government posts with loyalists. He chose who could lead, who could rise. His family, brothers, sisters, in-laws were placed on thrones across Europe. Kingdoms became branches of his will. He redrew the map of Europe, not with treaties, but with battles. Austria, Prussia, Italy, Spain, all were pulled into his vision of order. He believed not only in French greatness, but in his own destiny. To shape the continent. To many, he was a hero. To others, a tyrant in disguise. His rule brought glory, but also silence. Beauty, but also boundaries, and at the heart of it all stood a man who had crowned himself not for ceremony, but because. He believed no one else could. The empire he built was brilliant, but it stood on the narrow edge of one man's vision. And as his shadow stretched across Europe, so too did the cracks beneath his feet. Napoleon's genius lay in the battlefield. He moved troops like pieces on a board, each step calculated, each moment sharp. At Austerlitz in 1805, he won what many called his greatest victory, outnumbered, yet flawless in execution. He was celebrated as invincible, but victory feeds confidence. And confidence, if left unchecked, can become hubris. In 1812, Napoleon made a decision that would haunt his empire. He turned his eyes to Russia. He believed it would be one more jewel in his crown. He gathered a vast army, over 600,000 men, from across Europe. An army not just of France, but of empire. They marched east under a summer sun. But Russia did not fight as expected. Towns were abandoned. Supplies were burned. The Russians retreated, drawing Napoleon further into the heart of a land that offered nothing but distance and cold. He reached Moscow. But it was empty, silent. Fires soon consumed the city. There was no surrender, no peace. Winter came early. The retreat was brutal. Hunger, frost, disease, they struck with no mercy. Roads became graves. Horses fell. Soldiers froze where they slept. Of the massive army that crossed into Russia, only a fraction returned. It was not just a defeat. It was a fracture. His enemies saw the moment and moved. Prussia, Austria, Britain, they rose again. Battles followed. Leipzig, the Peninsular, war in Spain. More blood, more loss. Napoleon remained defiant. But the myth of invincibility had cracked. And as Europe closed in, even allies turned cold. His empire, once bound by pride, began to fray out by 1814. Paris itself was under threat. The Senate, once obedient, declared him deposed. He abdicated and was exiled to Elba, a small island off the Italian coast. For a time, the man who had once ruled nearly all of Europe stood alone, his sword quiet, his name uncertain. It was hubris belief that his will could bend all things that brought him there. And though he would rise once more, the fall had already begun. In 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba. He returned to France, landing quietly, greeted not with resistance, but with cheers. Soldiers sent to arrest him joined him instead. Crowds gathered. Paris opened its arms. The 100 days had begun. For a brief moment, the empire returned. Napoleon stood once more at the center of the world. But the moment was fleeting. At Waterloo in June, the hopes ended. British and Prussian forces crushed his army. The dream died. This time for good, he was captured, exiled again, this time to St. Helena, a distant island in the South Atlantic. No escape, no army, just wind, stone, and silence. There, Napoleon lived out his final years. The man who once ruled millions now had a few companions, a small house, and a sea that stretched endlessly. He wrote, often bitterly. He defended his choices, his legacy. He told stories of glory, painted his image once more. But the empire was gone. The crown, the cheers, the maps drawn in his name all faded. He died in 1821, far from France, far from power. Just 51 years old, his story in the end is one of brilliance and blindness. He rose through talent, vision, and courage. But he fell through belief that limits were for others, that destiny would never turn. His legacy remains divided. To some, he is a reformer, a genius who brought order to chaos. To others, a tyrant whose wars cost millions of lives. Both views contain truth, but perhaps his life offers something deeper, a reflection on power, on how quickly it grows, and how easily it can slip away. Napoleon once held Europe in his hand, but he left the world on a rock in the ocean, whispering his own story to waves that no longer listened, and in that, his empire ends not with battle, but with the quiet sound of water and the long shadow of a man who could not stop climbing. The priest-king Cyrus the Great, in the vast landscape of ancient rulers, few names echo with as much reverence as Cyrus the Great. His story rises from the windswept plains of Persia, wrapped in legend, bound by power, and softened by mercy. To many, he is remembered not for cruelty or conquest, but for compassion, a king who valued justice over domination, and who treated the fallen not as spoils, but as people. Cyrus was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, the first great Persian dynasty. By the time of his death, his reach stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, covering lands of immense variety and cultures of deep complexity. Yet unlike many conquerors before and after him, Cyrus left behind not just fear, but admiration. Even his enemies, including the Babylonians and Greeks, spoke of him with unusual respect. The story told is one of wisdom. When he conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he did not burn its temples or enslave its people. Instead, he is said to have entered the city peacefully. He freed the Jews who had been held in captivity there, allowing them to return to Jerusalem. He respected local customs, restored gods to their shrines, and issued declarations not in his own language alone, but in the tongue of those he ruled. This earned him a place not only in history, but in Scripture. In the Hebrew Bible, he is called the Anointed One, a title rarely given to outsiders. In later centuries, Enlightenment thinkers would look to Cyrus as a model of what a ruler could be: powerful, yet restrained. Mighty, yet just, but legends often grow smooth with time. The image of Cyrus as the model of mercy is alluring, comforting, even inspiring. It tells us that power can be kind, that empires can be just, that a king wrapped in gold can still bow to something higher, and yet every crown carries weight. Every empire leaves shadows. Cyrus's image, though gentle in retelling, began as a message carefully shaped, shared by priests and scribes, carried across lands that he ruled. It asked people to believe, and for many, it worked, but before we accept the myth, we must first walk beneath it, to see what lies beyond the glowing edge of mercy, and to understand how stories of greatness are built not just in temples and scrolls, but in choices, consequences, and the silence between truth and memory. The image of Cyrus as a merciful ruler is powerful, but beneath that polished surface, his rise to power tells a more complex story, one carved in campaigns, ambition, and the realities of conquest. Cyrus was born into royalty, a prince of the Persian Achaemenid line. At the time, his people were ruled by the Medes, another powerful Iranian tribe. In the mid-6th century BC, Cyrus revolted. He overthrew his Median grandfather and united the Persians and Medes under his banner. It was a swift, calculated move, one not of mercy, but of ambition. From there, his empire began to expand. He conquered Lydia, a wealthy kingdom in Asia Minor. Its capital, Sardis, fell to his forces. Then came Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. Each campaign was marked by careful strategy, swift movement, and when needed, overwhelming force. The Persian army under Cyrus was disciplined and deadly. He employed archers, cavalry, and siege engineers. He was pragmatic, adaptable, and relentless. Cities that resisted were taken. Rulers who opposed him were crushed. Mercy came, but only after victory, and yet Cyrus was no brute. He understood the value of stability. After each conquest, he worked to preserve local systems. He restored temples not because he worshipped every god, but because he knew it secured loyalty. He allowed regional customs to flourish because it kept the peace. His tolerance was not weakness. It was strategy. He ruled a vast, diverse empire, one that could not be held by fear alone. In that, he was ahead of his time. He saw that control did not always require violence, it required respect, or at least the appearance of it. Still, not all bowed willingly. Some resisted. Some lands were taken by force. The ancient world did not grant empires without struggle, and Cyrus earned his through blood and steel. His legacy, though gentler than many of his successors, was still built on conquest. His decisions shaped lives destroyed. Dynasties redrew borders, and so the question arises, was Cyrus merciful or merely effective? Did he act with kindness or with foresight? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between. He was not a king of peace, but he was not a king of ruin either. He was something in between, a ruler who balanced force with policy, ambition with tolerance. A conqueror who saw the future not as a throne for himself alone, but as a structure that needed stability to last. Beneath the legend lies a man who understood power deeply, and who used it with care, not always gently, but often wisely. In the ruins of ancient Babylon, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary in 1879. A clay cylinder covered in Akkadian cuneiform, small in size, but vast in meaning. It would come to be known as the Cyrus cylinder, often called the world's first declaration of human rights. In it, Cyrus describes how he took Babylon without battle, how he was welcomed as a liberator, how he restored temples, returned sacred idols, and allowed displaced peoples to return to their homes. It speaks not in the voice of a tyrant, but of a savior, a restorer, a chosen one, but the cylinder, for all its beauty, is also a message, a royal proclamation, crafted carefully, shared widely. It was not hidden. It was meant to be read, too, be known, to be remembered. It was propaganda early, elegant, and effective. The words serve many purposes. They soothe the conquered. They frame Cyrus not as a foreign king, but as a rightful ruler. They connect him to the gods of the people he now governed. By echoing local beliefs, he claimed legitimacy. This was not new. Ancient kings often inscribed their deeds in stone. But Cyrus's version was unique in tone. Less thunderous, more thoughtful. It speaks of peace, of harmony. And in that tone, it shaped his reputation. Modern readers, looking back, often see the cylinder as proof of his progressive thinking. And perhaps, in part, it is. His policies were certainly more inclusive than many before him. But it was also a tool, a symbol of how deeply Cyrus understood the role of story in shaping rule. The cylinder didn't change hearts alone, it reminded them who held power and why it was safe to accept him. Today, it rests in museums. Copies are displayed across the world. It is cited in discussions of justice, tolerance, and leadership. It stands not just as an artifact, but as an idea that kings can be kind, that rule can be righteous, but we must remember, it was still written by power. For power, its beauty does not lie in purity, but in complexity, in how Cyrus shaped his empire not only with armies, but with words, not only through war, but through narrative. And in that, the cylinder speaks twice, once of mercy, and once of mastery. As centuries passed, Cyrus the Great became more than a king. He became a symbol of justice, of empire, of wisdom. His name was carried by poets, historians, and prophets. He was admired by Alexander the Great. He was praised in the Hebrew Bible. He inspired political thinkers from ancient Rome to modern Iran, but like all symbols, his image split from his reality. Cyrus died in battle around 530 BCE, likely while campaigning in the northeast. The details are unclear, lost in the fog of time. His tomb at Pasargadi remains a quiet, simple structure, stone stacked on stone. No grand palace, no golden crown, just stillness. It's a fitting end for a man whose legacy grew louder after his death. He ruled with pride, but also with purpose. He claimed divine favor, yet listened to many gods. He sought peace, but through power. His was a rule of balance, of walking the line between reverence and reality. In a world often torn by harsh rulers, Cyrus offered a different story. Whether fully true or not, it mattered. People believed in the idea of him. They needed to. In him, they saw the rare hope that power and compassion could live together. And yet, his empire did not last forever. His descendants, including Darius and Xerxes, would take different paths. Wars followed. Rebellions grew. The legacy fractured. Still, the image of Cyrus endured. Because it was never just about one man. It was about the dream that leadership could be more than fear. That a ruler could rule not only with a sword, but with a steady hand. Between pride and prophecy stands the story of Cyrus. Neither saint, nor brute, neither fiction, nor fact. A blend of mercy and might, humility and strategy. His life reminds us that history's brightest lights are rarely pure. They shine through dust, through choices, through stories shaped and reshaped over time. As we leave his chapter, we carry not only the memory of a king, but the idea of what leadership can become when it listens, learns, and dares to lead with something more than force. And in that quiet idea, His voice still echoes across stone, across time, across belief. The architect of power, Peter the Great, in the final years of the 17th century, Russia stood vast and cold, proud in history, yet distant from the Europe that surged ahead in art, science, and trade. It was a land of long winters and longer traditions, where the Tsar still ruled as both sovereign and symbol. But from this land rose a ruler unlike any before. Tall, restless, and full of vision, Peter Alexeyevich Romanov Peter the Great was determined to pull Russia into a new age. From his youth, Peter showed little patience for ceremony. He loved ships more than scrolls, tools more than titles. As a teenager, he wandered the foreign corridors of Moscow, fascinated by Dutch sailors, German engineers, and ideas from lands far beyond the Russian steppe. The seeds of change were planted early, and they would grow with intensity. In 1697, Peter embarked on what became known as the Grand Embassy, a long, disguised journey through Western Europe. He visited shipyards in Holland, walked the bustling streets of London, and studied in the courts of kings. He saw how nations advanced not just through strength, but through structure, through trade, technology, and openness to change. He returned to Russia with new eyes. What he saw now was not tradition, but delay. He saw long beards, wooden tools, slow processes. He wanted more ships, more cities, more science. And above all, he wanted Russia to matter in the world. Beyond its borders, the Western dream became his obsession. He changed the calendar, rewrote laws, reformed the army. He ordered nobles to shave their beards, wear Western clothes, and send their children abroad to learn. He built an entirely new capital, St. Petersburg, on swampy ground near the Baltic Sea, meant to face Europe, not retreat from it. It was not merely a change of policy. It was a transformation of identity. Peter saw himself not only as a ruler, but as a craftsman of a new Russia, one that would compete, not just survive. His dream was of a nation that stood tall among others. And he believed fiercely that the only way forward was through forceful reinvention. But dreams, when pursued without pause, often demand a price, and Peter's vision, though powerful, was not soft. It did not ask. It commanded. And the weight of his Western dream would soon press heavily on the shoulders of his people. Peter's reforms did not arrive with gentle persuasion. They arrived with edicts, with punishment, with pressure that left no room for refusal. The transformation he imagined for Russia required more than ideas. It required bodies, hands, and silent obedience. The new capital, St. Petersburg, became his most visible ambition. Rising from swampland, it was a city born from will alone. Thousands of laborers, many of them peasants and prisoners, were forced to work in brutal conditions. Disease swept through the camps. The ground froze their tools. The city grew, but so did the graves beneath its foundations. St. Petersburg sparkled with marble and gold, its palaces glowing with European design. But the shine was built on suffering. Men were buried beneath the stones they placed there. Names forgotten, their toil absorbed into the vision of a czar who had not slowed down. Across the empire, taxes increased. Peasants bore the heaviest burden. Their fields fed armies. Their sons were conscripted for life. Their homes were taxed, sometimes even by the number of windows or beards. The state crept into every corner, demanding loyalty, labor, and silence. Those who resisted faced swift punishment. Peter created a secret police force. Spies flourished. Torture became routine. Executions were public. The message was clear. Progress had no room for hesitation, and yet change did come. The army modernized. New industries took root. Russia began to build ships, to open schools, to print books. Trade expanded. The nation grew stronger faster, more connected, more visible in Europe, but beneath the surface was exhaustion. Peter viewed his people as instruments of his will. Their comfort was secondary to his cause. He did not ask if they were ready, only if they would obey. To many, he was a reformer. To others, a tyrant. Both are true. His progress was real. But it was cruel. He sculpted a new empire, yes. But the sculptor used not only tools but pressure. Not only design but demand, and as the statues rose, the voices that cried beneath them faded, unheard. For all his ambition, Peter the Great could not control everything. And nowhere was this more visible than within his own family, his first. Marriage, arranged and cold, brought him a son, Alexei. The boy grew up beneath the shadow of a father he feared more than loved. Peter, always moving, always building, had little patience for hesitation. But Alexei was not a soldier, not a reformer. He preferred quiet, tradition, and religion. The very things Peter sought to leave behind. As the boy grew into a man, the divide widened. Peter saw in him not a successor, but a symbol of resistance. Rumors swirled. Whispers of rebellion, of alliances with conservative nobles, of a quiet refusal to continue the Western dream. Peter confronted his son. He offered a chance to renounce his inheritance and leave quietly. Alexei agreed, fleeing abroad. But Peter could not let it rest. He demanded his return, and Alexei, perhaps foolishly, perhaps with hope, came back. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of Peter's reign. Alexei was arrested, accused of treason, and imprisoned. He was interrogated, some say tortured. Records remain unclear. But within weeks he died in prison. Whether from wounds or fear, no one knows for sure. He was 28. Peter had lost his only son. Not in battle, not to fate, but by his own hand. The court fell silent. Even those closest to the Tsar struggled to reconcile what had happened. How could a man who had reshaped a nation be so broken at home? How could a father so mighty be so afraid of his own child? Peter would go on to marry again. He named a new heir, changed succession laws, and continued to rule with iron certainty. But something shifted. He had brought his nation forward, yet left his family behind. His palace gleamed, but the hallways held echoes. His vision of strength left no space for weakness, not even in his own blood, and in that space fear grew. Not just in his court, but within himself. Power, when built without balance, turns inward. It devours not only its enemies, but those closest to its flame. Peter the Great died in 1725, worn by illness, but never broken in will. He left behind a nation transformed, a Russia that looked westward, stood taller, and held greater sway in the world. His accomplishments were undeniable. But so, too, were the scars. St. Petersburg stood as a symbol of his reign, bold, beautiful, and built on ice. The city faced Europe, just as he had intended. But behind its facades lay suffering, silence, and a legacy shaped by iron hands. Peter was remembered by some as a hero, a titan who dragged Russia from the past and carved it into the modern world. To others, he was a tyrant cloaked in reform, a man who loved his nation more than he loved its people. He challenged the church, reshaped the army, restructured the state. He built canals, factories, schools. He also exiled, tortured, and ruled with fear. The paradox of Peter is that his greatness came not in spite of cruelty, but through it. And so we ask, can greatness born of suffering ever be truly noble? The question lingers in history like mist on the Neva River. There is no easy answer. Peter's dream brought progress, but his methods left pain. His name lives on in monuments, in books, in cities that still carry his vision, but also in the quiet spaces where families once wept, where sons feared fathers, where obedience drowned out voice. His legacy is a mirror reflecting not only what he built, but how he built it. Some rulers lead with love, others with law. Peter led with force and believed that history would forgive him if the result was strong enough. Perhaps it has. Perhaps it hasn't, but in the cold, still night, when the streets of his city fall quiet, there remains the echo of his footsteps. Steady, unyielding, unforgettable, and with them, the whisper of a question that every architect of power must one day face: is a kingdom worth building, if it costs the soul that built it? He, builder of palaces, King Solomon. The name Solomon brings to mind images of grandeur and wisdom, of golden halls and judgments that echo through time. He ruled in an age when Israel stood tall among nations, its capital vibrant, its king admired far beyond its borders. The stories passed down speak of a man both thoughtful and mighty, a ruler whose wisdom was said to be a divine gift. He was the son of David, the beloved king who united the tribes and gave Israel strength. Solomon inherited more than a crown. He inherited a moment, one of promise, peace, and potential. And from that moment, he built a kingdom unlike any before it in the land. Early in his reign, Solomon asked for wisdom, not wealth. The tale tells of a dream, a divine offer, and a humble request. In return, he received not only the wisdom he sought, but treasures. He never asked for power, prosperity, and peace on every side. His wisdom was famed. Stories tell of two women, one child, and a test of truth that revealed the depth of his judgment. Rulers and travelers came to hear his thoughts. The Queen of Sheba arrived with spices and gold, amazed at the order of his court, the splendor of his home, and the clarity of his words. Wealth flowed through his kingdom like a river. Ships sailed from far coasts. Trade routes brought silver, cedar, horses, and incense. He adorned his palace with ivory, drank from vessels of gold, and surrounded himself with the finest of what the world offered. The city of Jerusalem gleamed beneath the sun, rich in beauty and in pride. But amid all the gold and glory, something subtle began to shift. Solomon, though wise, did not rule in isolation. With expansion came complexity. With riches came the risk of forgetting their weight. And with wisdom came the temptation to see too far, and perhaps to feel beyond the bounds of caution, for even kings must choose how to balance gift and responsibility. And not all choices are as noble as they first seem. One of Solomon's greatest undertakings was the building of the temple, a place to house the Ark of the Covenant, a sanctuary meant to honor the God who had led Israel through centuries of struggle. It was to be no simple structure. It was to be a house of stone, gold, cedar, and glory. 7 years it took to build. Skilled laborers from across the kingdom were called. Cedar came from Lebanon, stone from distant quarries. Craftsmen carved intricate patterns. Priests prepared sacred spaces. Every surface was adorned. Every chamber measured with care. It was a monument of faith, yes, but also a monument of empire. To fund such splendor, Solomon expanded taxation. He introduced corvée labor, conscripting men from the tribes to work without pay for set periods. The cost was not only in silver, but in time, in sweat, in silence. The beauty of the temple was undeniable, but its foundation was laid with effort not freely given, and it didn't stop with the temple. Solomon built palaces, many of them. He constructed a royal house that took longer than the temple itself. He raised walls, gates, and cities fortified with his name. Roads were repaired, stables built, military supplies stored, the land changed. So did the people. What began as unity slowly turned into burden. the northern tribes, farther from Jerusalem, bore much of the labor. Their voices began to whisper about fairness, about privilege, about a king who once asked for wisdom now demanding too much. Solomon's reign, while peaceful, was not simple. The prosperity at the heart of Jerusalem was not equally felt across the land. The countryside saw less gold, more toil. Their sons left for royal work crews. Their fields grew quiet in seasons of royal construction. It is here that the weight of leadership showed its cost. Solomon had built a kingdom that dazzled the world. But in doing so, he strained the bond with his people. The temple rose to the heavens while murmurs of discontent rose from the earth. A king may build monuments, but a people must carry them. And when that weight is not shared, the ground begins to crack. In Solomon's final years, the unity of Israel began to show its wear. The seeds of division had been sown not with swords, but with choices gradual, layered, and easy to miss until it was too late. He had married widely, forming alliances through hundreds of marriages. These foreign queens brought their customs, their gods, their sacred rites. And though Solomon's heart remained tied to the temple he built, his hands began to raise shrines to other deities. Altars appeared on hillsides. Sacred groves were allowed to grow. Rituals once outlawed found space again for a king who began. With such clarity, the lines blurred. His court, once praised for justice, grew more complex. Bureaucracy thickened. Taxes rose again. The splendor at the center of Jerusalem now contrasted sharply with the burden carried by outer provinces. The people noticed. So did his own officials. Jeroboam, one of Solomon's overseers, emerged as a symbol of that discontent. A man of ability and ambition, he challenged the system quietly at first. But when Solomon heard of the rising threat, he acted quickly. Jeroboam fled into exile. The kingdom held, but just barely. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam inherited the throne. The moment was delicate. Delegates came from the tribes, asking for relief for a lighter burden, a softer rule. Rehoboam, advised by the young and prideful, answered harshly. "My father laid heavy burdens," he said. "I will make them heavier." It was a breaking point. The northern tribes, tired of years of being taxed, conscripted, and ignored, rebelled. They crowned Jeroboam as their king. The United Kingdom, once so strong under David and Solomon, was no more. Israel split into two: the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. What had begun with golden halls ended in fracture. Not with war, but with words. Not with invasion, but with exhaustion. Solomon never saw the collapse. He died still cloaked in dignity, but the cracks beneath his throne had already spread. His vision of glory, though lasting, came with cost. One paid not by enemies, but by his own people, and so his legacy became dual. He was remembered for wisdom, yes, but also for imbalance, for understanding the world, yet forgetting the weight of those who walked beneath him. In the end, Solomon's life reads like a tapestry of opposites: wisdom and indulgence, faith and tolerance, justice and strain. He was a king who asked for understanding and received it in full measure. Yet even with such a gift, he found himself drawn to splendor, to symbols, to the weightless pull of power's comfort. His writings or those attributed to him reflect this complexity. In Proverbs, he speaks of restraint, of clarity, of wise paths. In Ecclesiastes, the tone is different, tired, almost bitter. All is vanity, it says, chasing after the wind. It's as if two voices remain, one from the beginning of his reign, full of hope and structure, the other from the end, full of questions. Perhaps this is the truth of greatness, that even those given the most insight still struggle to carry. it. That wisdom, when placed beside unchecked wealth, can bend. That a kingdom built on glory may still rust beneath the surface, Solomon gave the world beauty. He wrote. He judged. He built. His temple stood for centuries, long after his bones had turned to dust. But his kingdom, the unity he inherited, did not survive him. He left behind a son, a divided land, and a question that still echoes. Can a leader hold the balance between vision and restraint? Can a builder of palaces also build peace? Solomon's story does not offer easy answers. It does not end in triumph or collapse, but somewhere in between. A life of light and shadow, of insight and excess, of wisdom that saw far, but not always. Near Date, as we close this chapter, we remember Solomon not only for what he built, but for what it cost. His name lives on, etched into stone and scripture. But his legacy, like the walls of his palace, holds both strength and silence, and in that silence we hear the quiet truth. Even the wisest kings must learn that every palace casts a shadow. Queen of Empire Cleopatra, in the soft, golden light of the Nile, Cleopatra's name still glows like incense rising from a distant temple. She is remembered as a woman of extraordinary beauty, a seductress of emperors, a queen whose shadow stretched from Alexandria to Rome. But beneath the myths, beyond the silks and perfumes, there was something far rarer, a ruler of rare brilliance, navigating a world built for men with nothing but her mind, her courage, and her crown, Cleopatra. Seven Philopator was the last active pharaoh of Egypt, a descendant not of native blood, but of Macedonian Greek lineage through the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled since the time of Alexander the Great. She was born into a palace of marble and danger, where siblings were rivals and loyalty changed like the tide from her earliest years. Cleopatra learned not only to read and speak, but to think. She mastered philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and over half a dozen languages. Most remarkably, she chose to learn the native Egyptian tongue, something her royal predecessors had not done. It was a quiet, powerful gesture, an acknowledgement of the land she ruled, and a desire to belong to it fully, but even her intelligence could not shield her from the brutal realities of dynastic succession. She ruled alongside her brother, Ptolemy XIII, but soon tensions rose. Civil conflict loomed, and Cleopatra, still in her early 20s, was exiled from her own palace, yet she did not retreat. In 48 BC, she famously met Julius Caesar, not as a helpless beauty, but as a strategist. She was smuggled into the royal palace, rolled inside a carpet, a performance as theatrical as it was calculated. She knew Caesar could restore her throne, and she intended to win his mind as much as his support. This meeting sparked a partnership, political and eventually personal. Cleopatra gave birth to Caesar's son, Caesarion, and was restored to power. For a brief moment, the stars seemed to align. Still, the myth of her beauty endures above all. But records suggest it was not appearance that captivated, it was presence. She was charismatic, commanding, with a voice that could charm and challenge in equal measure. Ancient sources speak of her wit, her elegance, and her ability to turn conversation into persuasion. She was not merely beautiful. She was brilliant, and the image of Cleopatra as enchantress, while powerful, has long obscured the deeper truth that she reigned in an age of empires and outmaneuvered many of the men who ruled them. She was never just a queen of beauty, she was a queen of power. Cleopatra's reign was shaped by alliances not of romance, but of survival. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, the world shifted violently once again. Rome descended into political chaos. Power fragmented between rival generals. In that chasm, Cleopatra had to decide her next move. She aligned herself with Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest allies. Their meeting, years after Caesar's death, has become legendary. She sailed to him on a grand barge adorned like a floating temple. Perfume, music, silk, all used with intention. But beneath the display was diplomacy. Cleopatra needed Antony's military strength. Antony needed Egypt's wealth. Their union was as much about politics as it was about passion. Their alliance grew into something larger, personal, familial, imperial. Together, they had 3 children. Together, they envisioned a new future. Antony gave Cleopatra territory. She crowned their son as king. They dreamed of building an Eastern empire to rival Rome itself, but the tides of Roman politics turned. Against them, Octavian Caesar's adopted son saw their partnership as a threat. He painted Cleopatra as a manipulative foreign queen who had corrupted a noble Roman general. Antony, once celebrated, was now portrayed as a fallen figure enslaved by love and ambition. The propaganda campaign was effective. Rome rallied. Behind Octavian, war became inevitable. In 31 BC, their forces met at the Battle of Actium, a massive naval confrontation along the Greek coast. The engagement was chaotic and devastating. As their fleet faltered, Cleopatra's ships turned and fled, a tactical retreat or an act of panic. Antony followed. Their defeat was complete. They returned to Egypt, broken but not yet beaten. They attempted to rebuild, to prepare. But Octavian closed in slowly, methodically. In 30 BC, Roman troops entered Alexandria. Faced with no escape and no future, Antony took his own life. Cleopatra, now truly alone, was left with a final decision. She could surrender and be paraded through Rome as a trophy, or she could end the story on her own terms. She chose the latter. Tradition says she used an asp, a venomous serpent. Others believe it was poison. The method is debated. The meaning is not Cleopatra, queen of Egypt, daughter of Ptolemy, last pharaoh of a dynasty 200 years old, died at her own hand. She was 39. Her kingdom fell with her. Egypt became a Roman province. Her children were taken. Her legacy rewritten, but even in death, she chose sovereignty. She was not conquered. She exited as she had lived, with fire, with grace, and with control. Her death marked the end, not only of a reign, but of a civilization. For over 3,000 years, Egypt had been ruled by pharaohs, some divine, some flawed, all bound to the land and sky of their people. Cleopatra was the last to hold that title. Rome, under Octavian, would not allow such independence to survive. The new emperor, soon to be known as Augustus, annexed Egypt as his personal province. The land of pyramids and papyrus, of temples and gods, now bowed beneath a foreign standard. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, was quietly executed. The remaining children, born of her union with Antony, were taken to Rome. They disappeared into history. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ended not with a battle, but with a silence. Alexandria, once a beacon of learning and culture, faded. Its great library, already in decline, would eventually vanish. Its role shifted from center to colony. Its voice became Rome's voice. The fall was not sudden, but complete. Cleopatra's vision of a stable, powerful Egypt ruled by native sovereignty died with her, and in its place, a new world order began to rise. One where provinces replaced kingdoms, where emperors replaced pharaohs, where the East, once rich in wisdom and splendor, became background to a rising Western myth. Yet the memory of Cleopatra did not fade. Roman writers could not ignore her. They immortalized her and distorted her. She became a villain in their narratives, the foreign temptress who brought ruin to noble men. They blamed her for Antony's fall, for Rome's near collapse, for breaking tradition and crossing lines. Drawn by distant patriarchy, but they also could not forget her. Her story remained, etched into the margins of empire. Her name whispered in courts and theaters. Her face imagined again and again. She had lost her throne. But she had become legend, and sometimes legend is stronger than rule. Centuries have passed, yet Cleopatra's name still flickers like a torch in the dark, steady, mysterious, alive. But what do we truly remember? Is it the queen or the myth? The leader or the lover? The woman who navigated empire or the one painted in gold and perfume? Cleopatra's image has been shaped by every era that followed her. Roman poets made her a warning. Renaissance painters turned her into tragedy. Victorian scholars debated her morality. Hollywood crowned her with eyeliner and jewels, but few looked at her as she was, a sovereign navigating a collapsing world, a scholar fluent in many tongues, a mother, a strategist, a ruler trying to protect her people in the face of unstoppable change. She ruled in a time when survival required performance. She wore beauty like armor. She used presence like a blade. But behind that performance was a mind sharper than many, more prepared than most. Her legacy is complex because she was complex. Neither saint nor siren, but something more difficult and more human. She walked a narrow path between diplomacy and desperation, between brilliance and risk. She made choices, some wise, some flawed. But she made them herself. That alone made her dangerous in the eyes of many, and perhaps that is why her image was rewritten. Because history is often uncomfortable with women who hold power without apology. Today, we begin to reclaim her. To see her not through the gaze of conquerors or dramatists, but through her own actions. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt. Not because she failed, but because the world around her shifted beyond any one ruler's control. She left no dynasty, no nation, but she left a question. What does it mean to lead with intelligence in a world that wants only simplicity? Cleopatra lived the answer, and in doing so, she became more than a queen. She became a mirror reflecting not only her own story, but the way we tell stories about power, about gender, about empire itself, and so she remains not just in books, but in the quiet space where truth meets myth, a woman of empire, a queen of her time, a name that still resists forgetting. Crown and cross Charlemagne in the early centuries of medieval Europe, as the Roman world faded into memory and kingdoms rose from the soil of uncertainty. One figure would stand out, taller than most, stronger than many, and determined to bring unity to a fractured land. His name was Charlemagne. Born around the year 742, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, inherited a divided realm. The Frankish kingdom, passed down through dynasties, was both promise and burden, filled with ambition, yet fractured by tradition and tribal loyalties. But where others ruled small, Charlemagne thought wide. His vision stretched across rivers and forests, from the rough shores of the Atlantic to the snow-dusted peaks of the Alps. He did not want just a kingdom. He wanted an empire, yet it wasn't only land he sought to unite. It was belief. Charlemagne dreamed of a Christian realm not merely in name, but in structure, spirit, and law. The old Roman Empire had fallen centuries before, its glory scattered. But Charlemagne believed something new could be built upon the ruins. Something sacred. A new Christian order. He began by strengthening the church's place at the heart of his rule. Monasteries became centers of learning. Clergy became administrators. Bishops were no longer only voices of faith, but voices of power. The Latin tongue returned to courts and schools. Scripts were copied. Libraries grew. But this vision, lofty and devout, required more than prayer. It required conquest. By the end of his life, Charlemagne had brought most of Western Europe under his rule. His empire spanned what is now France, Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of Italy and Spain. He ruled with force, but also with organization. He sent out royal envoys missi dominici to ensure his commands reached the furthest villages. He issued capitularies, legal texts that blended Christian ideals with royal authority. In 800, on Christmas Day, Pope Leo III crowned him emperor in Rome, reviving the old imperial dignity under a new name. The Holy Roman Empire. It was the crowning moment of a long journey. A king had become emperor. A warlord had become lawgiver. A ruler of men had become protector of the faith. But beneath the gold of the crown and the quiet hymns of the choir, shadows stretched. Charlemagne's empire was vast. But its unity came not through peace alone, and not all converts came willingly. And so, the story of the great unifier begins in glory, but does not end there. Charlemagne's mission to create a Christian empire did not rely on words alone. His rule, so often remembered for reform and revival, was equally defined by war and by the sharp edge of belief enforced through steel. The Saxons, a pagan people living in what is now northern Germany, stood fiercely outside the boundaries of his empire. They worshipped old gods, held tight to local traditions, and resisted the spread of Christianity. To Charlemagne, they represented more than political resistance. They were, in his eyes, a spiritual threat. He launched campaign after campaign. More than 30 years of conflict. Villages were burned. Sacred groves were cut down. The Irminsul, a towering symbol of Saxon worship, was destroyed. Charlemagne sought not only to defeat them in battle, but to erase the foundation of their belief. And then came Verdi and Dot in the year 782. After a series of uprisings, Charlemagne ordered the mass execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners. They had resisted his rule and his religion. He responded not with negotiation, but with death. It was a moment of horror, a decision that stained his legacy and echoed through time. His defenders would later argue necessity. His critics, cruelty, but what cannot be erased is the fact, in pursuit of spiritual unity, violence was used as a tool. Baptisms followed battles. Converts were registered like cattle. Churches were built where temples once stood. The cross marched behind the sword, and yet Charlemagne did not act without structure. He believed deeply in the Christian faith and saw its spread as divine duty. His laws required attendance at church, tithing, and religious instruction. He demanded his people follow a sacred order, even if they had to be dragged in two. This was the contradiction at the heart of his rule. A man who believed in salvation, but was willing to kill to reach it. A ruler who reads Scripture, yet wrote laws of punishment. A king who raised altars, but never sheathed his sword for long. To many, he was the protector of Christendom. To others, a conqueror cloaked in piety, the Saxons eventually submitted. They were absorbed into the empire. But at what cost? Faith, when forced, carries scars. And the faith of Charlemagne, though sincere, moved with the thunder of hooves and the strike of steel. His mission had been achieved. But peace built through fear is a fragile thing. Charlemagne ruled not only through war, but through law. His empire, vast and varied, needed order. And so he crafted it with careful hands. He gathered scholars, priests, and judges. He called councils. He issued capitularies, royal directives that touched everything from religious observance to land disputes. These documents reflected a vision of justice grounded in both scripture and governance. They sought to bring clarity to chaos, but clarity in theory is not always compassion in practice. The emperor's laws were strict. Theft could be punished by mutilation, heresy by death. A man who skipped Mass could be fined, a woman who performed. An old pagan rite could be publicly whipped. Charlemagne believed in order not only in cities and armies, but in souls. His laws protected churches, regulated markets, and dictated weights and measures. But they also reinforced hierarchy. Nobles had different penalties than peasants. Clergy were often above reproach. And those outside the Christian faith, if allowed to remain, were second class at best. His idea of justice was not blind. It was structured, deliberate, and always aimed toward the preservation of his Christian empire. Education was central to his reforms. He opened palace schools, required monasteries to teach, and encouraged the copying of ancient texts. Under his rule, the Carolingian Renaissance bloomed, a brief but brilliant revival of art, letters, and learning, and yet, even here, contradictions lingered. The same ruler who revived classical learning silenced dissent. The same man who spread literacy ordered massacres. The same law that promoted justice could condemn a man for a belief. Charlemagne's justice was shaped by vision, but narrowed by power. He sought to mold his people not only into good citizens, but into obedient believers. Dissent was not seen as thought, but as threat. And in that space, oppression often walked quietly, clothed in the language of peace. Still, his legal reforms brought a sense of structure to lands long ruled by custom and might. For many, life improved. Roads were safer. Disputes had process. Property had protection, but others lived beneath the shadow of law. Not its shelter, the emperor ruled as father of a vast household. But not all his children had the same seat at the table, and so we see again the tension that marks his reign between justice and judgment, between rule and righteousness. Charlemagne died in 814, at the age of 72, in the palace at Aachen. His body was buried in a modest tomb. Beneath a church, he had helped build a quiet place for a man whose life had been anything but quiet. His empire endured, for a time. But soon it fractured. His grandsons fought. Borders shifted. Enemies returned. What he had united with such effort slowly splintered, and yet his memory lived on. The Holy Roman Empire born with his coronation would continue for centuries, invoking his name. Kings and emperors sought to follow his path, to claim his mantle. The Church remembered him as a champion. Europe called him Pater Europae, the father of Europe. But behind the marble and the myth, questions remain. Can might ever sanctify rule? Charlemagne believed so. He saw no division between faith and force, between sword and scripture. He built churches, and he built armies. He protected the poor and punished the rebellious. He expanded knowledge and extinguished dissent. His rule brought unity, yes, but also blood. His laws brought order, but not always mercy. His crown placed upon his head by the Pope symbolized divine right. But it also marked the beginning of centuries where religion and power became tightly bound, and in that bond, much was achieved and much was lost. Today, we remember Charlemagne as a builder of nations, of law, of identity. But he also reminds us how easily goodness can be claimed by strength, how quickly faith can be used to justify conquest, how often peace is written in the language of power. His shadow is long. His legacy complex. He gave the West a new shape and a new story, but beneath the story, beneath the hymns and scrolls, lies a deeper truth. Even the most noble visions can cast dark shadows, and the holiest crowns are never without weight. The mirror of Elizabeth's eye in an age ruled by kings, where marriage was a crown's necessity, and a queen's worth was often measured by the children she could bear. Elizabeth I stood alone. Not by accident, but by design. She fashioned herself, not just as monarch, but as symbol. The Virgin Queen, a ruler whose body belonged to no man, whose reign was untouched by matrimony. To her people, she was both sovereign and sacred, as much an icon as a woman. It was a role carefully crafted, not born. Born in 1533 to King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth entered a world already shaped by scandal. Her mother's fall, her father's turbulent rule, and the religious upheaval of England all formed the backdrop of her early life. She was declared illegitimate, restored, ignored, watched. Power always danced just beyond reach, but Elizabeth observed. She studied courtly language, European politics, and the dangers of ambition. And when her time came, in 1558, she stepped onto the throne not as a pawn, but as a player. Her reign began in uncertainty. The kingdom was divided by religion, threatened by foreign powers, and unsure of its new queen's direction. Yet Elizabeth moved with patience. She wore compromise like armor. She crafted a Protestant church that left room for many. She chose counselors wisely. And most of all, she remained unmarried. This was no passive choice. Suitors came from across Europe, princes, dukes, and noblemen, each one carrying alliances and expectations. But Elizabeth refused them all. I am already married, she declared. To England, this vow became legend. Portraits began to reflect it. She stood adorned in pearls and white gowns, surrounded by symbols of purity and power. Her skin appeared flawless, untouched by time. She held roses, globes, scepters always poised, always alone to the world. She was untouchable. Above the fray, a queen who had turned herself into something more than human. But this image, powerful as it was, came at a cost. Elizabeth's celibacy was political. It gave her freedom in a world that would have otherwise chained her to a husband's will. But it also turned her life into performance. Every appearance, every gesture, every silence, all became part of a mirror she held up to her people. And in that mirror, they saw strength, grace, and purity, but they did not always see the woman who bore the weight behind the reflection. Behind the brilliant image of Elizabeth's reign lay a court pulsing with whispers. It was a place of music and masks, of feasts and formalities, but also of rivalry, spying, and calculation. Elizabeth's court was not only a seat of government. It was her stage. Every smile she gave, every favor she withheld, shaped alliances. She did not merely rule with laws, she ruled with presence. She cultivated loyalty through intimacy and distance, granting just enough to keep courtiers yearning, but never enough to lose her edge. Her affection was a currency. Her silence, a sword. One of her most trusted figures was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Their relationship was complex, affectionate, possibly romantic, and always watched. The Queen's closeness to Dudley stirred jealousy and rumors. But Elizabeth kept him and others in delicate balance. She did not allow any one person to rise too far. If a courtier grew too bold, they would be reminded, quietly or not, who held the crown. Promotions were measured. Punishments were often subtle, a removal from court, a delay in advancement, a turned shoulder at a royal dance, even those closest to her, like William Cecil, her faithful adviser, knew they walked a narrow path. She trusted, but rarely fully. Her decisions were her own. She sought counsel, but never control. Control extended to appearances. Elizabeth surrounded herself with a circle of women who helped maintain her image. Her gowns were stitched with precision. Her hair, often wigs in later years, arranged to perfection. Her famously pale complexion was the result of white lead makeup, a fashion of the time, but also a layer of armor. She understood that perception was power, that to rule, she had to seem eternal, unchanging, almost divine. Her court reflected this philosophy. Pageants, masks, and elaborate performances filled the halls. Even these entertainments were political tools used to flatter, to hint, to teach, but such control came with tension. Courtiers feared falling out of favor. Friendships were fragile. Letters were read. Alliances shifted quickly. Elizabeth watched it all and often orchestrated more than she let on. She created a system where love and fear walked hand in hand. A court where truth was rare and loyalty was always tested, and yet, through all of it, she remained poised, commanding, untouchable, not just a queen among courtiers, but the center of a carefully drawn circle. A circle she never allowed to close too tightly. While Elizabeth's court glimmered with art and elegance, the edges of her reign were sharp. Beneath the silks and sonnets lay a kingdom kept in line through careful and sometimes brutal control. Religious tension defined much of her rule. Though she forged a Protestant identity for England, Catholicism remained strong in parts of the realm. Elizabeth offered initial tolerance, but it was conditional. Loyalty to the crown had to come first. As threats mounted, especially after the Pope excommunicated her in 1570, repression grew harsher. Laws against Catholic priests were enforced. Masses held in secret were punished. To harbor a priest could mean death. To question the Queen's authority was treason. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, marked a chilling moment. Mary, a Catholic, with a claim to Elizabeth's throne, had become a magnet for rebellion. After years of captivity in England, plots to place her on the throne reached a breaking point. Elizabeth hesitated. To execute a fellow monarch was a weighty choice, one that blurred justice and fear. But in 1587, the order was given. Mary was beheaded. The Virgin Queen had protected her realm, but at the cost of another queen's life. Censorship was also part of her governance. Plays, pamphlets, and sermons were monitored. The printing press was watched closely. The image of Elizabeth wise, just, pure, could not be challenged. Dissent had to be quiet, or it would not be allowed at all. Her portraits were controlled. Artists were instructed to use approved patterns. As she aged, the paintings did not reflect it. Wrinkles were softened. Bodies remained youthful. Symbols of majesty, the phoenix, the globe, the Tudor rose framed her like a goddess. A T was not just vanity. It was policy. Elizabeth understood the power of myth. She knew her image was part of her authority. A queen must be more than real. She must be remembered. But beneath this careful vision, the real kingdom endured hardship. Poor harvests, rising prices, and unrest challenged her subjects. Rebellions flared in Ireland. Naval war with Spain drained resources. Not everyone lived beneath the safety of the crown's glow. For those on the margins, the poor, the silenced, the imprisoned, the Virgin Queen was not always a benevolent figure. To them, she was a ruler of distance, discipline, and demand. She ruled with skill, but not always with softness, and so, while England bloomed in literature and pride, it also whispered with fear. A golden age, yes, but one burnished by control. Elizabeth I died in 1603, after 44 years on the throne. She passed without a husband, without a child, the last of the Tudor line. Alone in her chambers, she left behind not only a crown, but a legend. Her legacy was immediate and enduring. Poets praised her. Statues rose. Her reign became Gloriana, the golden age of English greatness. Shakespeare's pen danced in her time. The seas, once feared, had been conquered at her order. The Spanish Armada defeated, she had made. England matter, but history, like mirrors, reflects differently depending on the light. To some, she was the perfect monarch, cunning, composed, a master of image and empire. To others, she was a lonely figure, surrounded by masks, ruling through performance. Her victories were real, but so were her sacrifices. Her refusal to marry gave her freedom, but also isolation. Her image of purity brought loyalty, but also endless pressure. Her crown gave her power and the burden to never falter. She built herself like a mirror, every angle controlled, every flaw hidden, every reflection designed to inspire awe, and in doing so, she taught the world a lesson. That echoes still, that leadership is not only action, but illusion. That power often depends not on truth, but on the belief that truth has already been shown. Elizabeth's image lives on in portraits, in plays, in school books and scripts. But her life, the long nights, the whispered doubts, the decisions no one else could make, remains just out of view. She was real. And she was also reflection, and so we close her chapter with the quiet knowledge that mirrors can both reveal and deceive. They show what we want to see and sometimes what must be hidden. The Virgin Queen held up such a mirror to a fractured world, and through it shaped her age. But in the stillness of time, even the clearest glass begins to fade, and all that remains is the question behind the crown. Did the woman beneath the myth ever get to look into her own reflection and truly see herself? Final reflections, thrones of shadow and silence, across centuries, across continents, through palaces built in marble and tents stitched in haste, we've followed the lives of those who wore crowns. Each ruler, whether feared or adored, stood on a stage far larger than themselves, one shaped by belief, geography, ambition, and silence, and not one among them was simple. Power wrapped itself around them like a cloak, heavy with expectations. Some wore it with grace. Some stumbled beneath it. But all were changed by it. Ramses II carved his name into stone, seeking immortality, yet turned his victories into performance. Ashoka spilled rivers of blood, only to spend the rest of his life washing them away with peace. Henry VIII demanded legacy, but shattered his kingdom in pursuit of sons and certainties. Elizabeth I stood alone, shaping herself into a myth, part woman, part mirror. Charlemagne, with sword and scripture, sought unity, but left behind scars. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher king, sowed ruin by handing power to blood. Cleopatra lived at the intersection of brilliance and threat, brilliance and collapse. Augustus veiled domination in ceremony. Napoleon crowned himself. Solomon wrote wisdom, but ruled with weight. Peter the Great built palaces and prisons alike. Their lives defy clean judgment. Because history, like the people who shape it, resists simplicity, some of them ruled with conviction, others with calculation. Some offered mercy, others knew only command. But all, in their own way, were prisoners of the time they lived in. And the stories they were expected to fulfill, they were shaped by war, by dynasty, by fear and need, by mothers lost too early, by fathers too distant, by prophecy and pressure, bloodlines and betrayal, by the weight of a people who needed order and the hunger within that longed to be remembered. These rulers were not only names in books or faces in portraits. They were first human, and that humanity flawed, fractured, reaching lived beneath every crown. Power is never simple. Because people never are dot in these rulers' lives, we see ambition stretch too far, justice turn sharp, and legacy become burden. But it is in their failures, quiet and loud, that we often learn the most. When Alexander burned Persepolis, history flinched. When Richard II ruled with poetry, but not prudence, his fall reminded us that beauty cannot replace strength. When Louis XIV built Versailles while his people starved, we saw what happens when appearance becomes obsession. Ashoka's remorse, born from the blood of Kalinga, teaches us that even conquest has a cost. The Saxon Wars of Charlemagne show that forced belief leaves wounds that faith alone cannot heal. Solomon's wisdom buckled beneath his indulgence. Augustus' careful legacy hit a rotting center. Their mistakes were not always acts of malice. More often, they were acts of blindness, seeing the world not as it was, but as they wished it to be. Elizabeth I, despite her brilliance, left a nation uncertain of its future. Napoleon, believing himself the center of Europe, brought it to its knees. Marcus Aurelius handed the Roman Empire to a son who unraveled it. These were not missteps. They were revelations, because in failure, we meet truth, we see what ambition looks like when it forgets its shadow, what pride becomes when it grows unchecked, what loyalty means when it's tested by fear. Their errors were, in some ways, universal, driven by loneliness, by pressure, by inherited belief. They remind us that leadership is not clarity made manifest. It is confusion managed at scale. We don't study their falls to mock them. We study them to remember what not to repeat. We learn that vision needs limits, that reform must be rooted in empathy, that legacy is built in quiet decisions, not only grand ones, and perhaps most of all, we learn that power, when not questioned, distorts. The greatest cautionary tales do not come from villains, but from those who tried to do good, but lost the thread of balance. The world today is shaped by hands long gone. Roads still run where Rome once marched. Laws echo codes written in palaces now ruined. Languages, borders, and names were forged beneath banners we no longer raise. The rulers we've explored did not vanish. Not truly, their ideas of order, of glory, of sacred right continue in new forms. In constitutions and parliaments, in leaders who speak of destiny, in people who follow without pause. Cleopatra's legacy lives in how we judge women in power. Solomon's in the myths we tell of wisdom and wealth. Peter's in how we measure progress by skyline rather than suffering. Charlemagne's dream of Christian empire still shapes politics, culture, and memory in the West. Even their absences speak. What Elizabeth withheld, a marriage, a child, a dynasty, left ripples across Europe. What Cyrus offered, tolerance written into stone, remains a model of dignity even today. These ghosts do not haunt. They shape. In every flag there is a shadow. In every oath, a reflection of rulers long dead. Their desires still pulse in palaces, in parliaments, in boardrooms and ballots, but not all of their echoes are warnings. We inherit not only their failures, but their moments of clarity, their willingness to choose mercy, to pause war, to build schools, preserve language, write laws that protected rather than punished. These flickers remind us that rule is not just weight. It is opportunity. Their ghosts whisper in how we educate, how we vote, how we resist injustice. They ask us again and again, what is the purpose of power? Who does it serve? And what price do we pay when we forget to ask? And so, we end where all crowns eventually return, not in glory, but in stillness. Each throne we have visited began as a seat of hope, of order, of safety. But with time, each one bore the shape of the person who sat in it, and the people who looked up to them, crown and blade, scepter and silence. We often imagine rulers as above us, brighter, stronger, chosen. But power, like fire, is neither good nor evil. It warms a home. It burns a village. It feeds and it consumes. We watch the crown not because it dazzles, but because it weighs, not because it promises, but because it warns. The faces change. The thrones shift. But the questions remain. Will we create rulers who listen? or only those who speak? Will we demand accountability or settle for spectacle? Will we remember that no myth is more dangerous than the one that says power is pure? To watch the crown is to watch ourselves, because rulers do not rise alone. They are lifted by belief, by stories, by silence. We shape them as much as they shape us. So, let us carry these reflections forward, not to judge, but to understand, not to rewrite history, but to listen to its heartbeat. In each of these lives, we found shadow and silence, triumph and tragedy, empire and emptiness, and through them all, we glimpsed what lies beyond the throne, a fragile human heart, always reaching, always uncertain, always shaped by the world it tried to rule. Let that be the final reflection, not of glory, but of grace.